This video is brought to you by all of my patrons on patreon.com/MaileyMandy, but a special thank you to Angela Ward, Beat Duck, David Linds, Polyamethyst, and Sicknin. Hey everyone. For those of you who are new here, my name is Mailey Mandy, and you picked a hell of a time to check out my channel. Today's video discusses the very serious issue of abusive relationships within the polyamorous community. I'll be discussing a number of disturbing behaviors associated with abusive relationships that include, but are not limited to, gaslighting, emotional manipulation, grooming, triangulation, and consent violations, some of which are related specifically to BDSM situations. I'll also be discussing at times suicide ideation and depression, as well as transphobia, homophobia, and racism. Yeah, this is gonna be a rough one. Also, as a heads up, there is going to be some drinking on camera later on, as well as a lot of swearing throughout the video, mostly because of the things I just mentioned. Also, I have decided that I'm turning monetization off on this video. I just don't feel like fighting with YouTube today, so I'm gonna swear as much as I want. Shit ass damn. This is a very simple video in many ways. It's not gonna have a lot of my usual razzle dazzle. Changes in costume are really just because I have to film over several days. I know that for my regular audience, they might expect a little bit more from me, and I'm very sorry if I disappoint you, but the number one person I have to make happy with these videos is myself. And that bitch be picky. I'm going to ask everyone watching this video two favors. Number one, please take care of yourselves. Watch this video in the manner that makes the most sense for you. Feel free to take lots of breaks. I will be adding chapters to make that a little bit easier, as well as maybe just waiting until you're in the right state of mind or watching with a friend who can help you co-regulate. And number two, if you do enjoy this video, please make sure that you like, share, and engage in the comments below. Between turning off monetization and honestly the reaction I am expecting from some parts of the polyamorous community, I do worry how well this video is going to do. By engaging in my comment section below and sharing this video, you are showing me support and helping me out actually quite a bit, even if all you write is cool story, bro. Something else that I need to acknowledge at the top of this video, I am not now, nor have I ever been, a journalist. I have biases, many of them in fact, and will not pretend otherwise. But also, if that's surprising to you, hi, welcome to YouTube. You must be new here. In making this video, I was actually in touch with some of the people involved in this situation, specifically some of the alleged survivors. That is going to instantly discredit me with certain sections in particular of the polyamorous community. Personally, I stand by this video and all the research I did, nearly a year's worth, that went into it. And as we go through this situation, I do intend to show you my math, as it were, so you can understand the conclusions that I came to and how I came to them. If my having spoken to alleged victims of toxic, harmful, and in some cases abusive behaviors bothers you, then probably you should push through that discomfort and watch this video anyway. But obviously I can't control you. Do what you think is best. That's what I've attempted to do, and I'll be able to sleep just fine tonight. Well, I mean, as fine as I usually do. I'll probably go first, you know, usually helps. Conversations like this are not easy to have, and I do not relish doing so. But I also do feel that they are very necessary. This is something that I really feel I have to do, and I will be making an earnest attempt to be as thorough and mindful as the situation calls for. Okay, let's talk about Franklin Vo. Part 1. More Than Two. More Than Two, A Practical Guide to Ethical Polyamory, was published on September 4th, 2014. It was written by Franklin Vo and Eve Rickert, the two of them also being partners at the time. More Than Two very quickly became a must-have on every polyamorous recommendation reading list throughout the country. It was pushed hard by people within the community and also had a very successful crowdfunding campaign. Having a foreword written by Janet Hardy, one of the authors of The Ethical Slut, probably didn't hurt either. For those of you who don't know, The Ethical Slut is kind of the polyamorous Bible. Hallelujah. In her review of the book, Amy Guerin of solopoly.net, and author of Stepping Off the Relationship Escalator, said,
"If you've never read any books on polyamory, this one should be your first. And even if you've read every book on polyamory, read this one now. I don't say this lightly."
Later on in that same review, Amy shares a story about how one of her partners, codename Io, ended up reading the book and then using its practices in earnest.
Io credits the concept's ethical framework and especially the questions posed at the end of each chapter of More Than Two with helping him and another of his partners make progress in discussing some touchy issues. Also, he noted that the book's chapter on hierarchy and primary-secondary polyamory, in combination with his recent understanding about the relationship escalator, especially helped him reconsider ways to approach relationships of any sort. Io definitely found More Than Two to not just be practical and helpful, but immediately beneficial.
Amy and Io were definitely not alone in singing its praises. It was heralded throughout the polyamorous community. If you had a blog, podcast, or any kind of soapbox in 2014, you were talking about this book. I think part of what made More Than Two so successful was its intended audience. Us polyamorous people absolutely adore reading listicles, articles, studies, any and all research about non-monogamy. It's our catnip. While More Than Two wasn't the first book about non-monogamy, hell, it wasn't even one of the first, it was just completely eaten up by the community. And to be fair, it did come out at a time when we weren't so saturated with polyamorous resources as we do now. There was a time when the polyphilia count did not exist. Dark times. I think another reason why this book was so popular as it was at the time is that it was covering this from a non-hierarchical angle, which at the time just wasn't really done, as well as through the viewpoint of ethics. More Than Two asked its readers to really dive into themselves more, to examine their own motivations, and to make agreements with themselves before doing so with partners. And yes, the fact that this book has gotten so much praise for its ethics is going to be very ironic later on. To this day, More Than Two consistently appears at the top of searches for books about polyamory. On Goodreads, it maintains a 4.34 out of 5-star rating. Last fall, it actually appeared in an episode of the Netflix show You. I know tons of people who said that More Than Two was the first book on polyamory they read, or else the first book on polyamory they read that actually really resonated with them. The book was published through Thorntree Press, a publishing house that was created by Eve and Franklin together. Thorntree Press would go on to publish many other books about non-monogamy and related subjects, including Love Is Not Colorblind by Kevin Patterson and Polysecure by Jessica Fern, both of which I own. More Than Two's success led to international book tours and interviews. Eve, and especially Franklin, were polyamorous celebrities. Though I should mention that Franklin did already have a level of notoriety within the polyamory world due to his many years of writing and blogging about polyamory, something he's been doing now since the 90s. Franklin decided to follow up the book with The Game Changer, a memoir of disruptive love, which was published the following year. The Game Changer didn't have as much a success as More Than Two, certainly not in sales and in terms of influence, but it still got a dedicated following. In general, a lot of people seem to really enjoy reading a more personal narrative about a non-monogamous life that included an admission of mistakes and vulnerability that made Franklin more relatable. One reviewer on Goodreads said,
"It's a gripping story about working out how to live outside of mainstream expectations while also being ethical to oneself and the people around you. I really appreciate how open Vo is about the ways he wound up inadvertently hurting people over the years. It's not easy to be self-aware that way, but it's so important."
And yeah, the fact that this book was praised for its openness and honesty is going to be very ironic later on. The last book Eve and Franklin wrote together was called Black Iron. This one, a fiction, was published in October of 2018. Eve and Franklin's relationship would end earlier that year in March before the official release of the book. After their relationship ended, Eve and Franklin swapped their respective shares of Thorntree Press and Tacit Pleasures, Franklin's strap-on business, although the legal side of things wouldn't be settled until February of 2021. In the end, Eve got control of Thorntree Press and Franklin of Tacit. The time following the breakup in 2018 was an interesting one, to say the least. Eve's blog, Brighter Than Sunflowers, would remain pretty much eerily quiet for almost a year, nothing about Franklin or anything else posted. Meanwhile, Franklin, the avid blogger and Quora writer, would have consistent and regular posts. And anyone paying even halfway attention would have noticed rather quickly that a pattern was beginning to emerge.
I have an ex who was highly controlling and possessed of a very bad temper. While many things about our relationship were amazing, I was always walking on eggshells around her temper. She would sometimes go into these violent rages where she would scream and break things that belonged to me. She said directly she was taking out unrelated frustrations on me. The election of Orange Mussolini and the cumulative effects of #MeToo both caused a tremendous amount of stress for her. She point blank told me during a long conversation about it that she felt angry and helpless about both of those things. And as a result, she directed a lot of that anger at the safest possible target, me. She had an anxious attachment style, was prone to fits of jealousy and anger, and from the very start of our relationship, she had an amount of control that, looking back, I'm surprised I was willing to put up with. I think she is a remarkable, extraordinary woman with a lot going for her, who also has a very serious anger management issue and has, unfortunately, not learned good strategies to deal with her emotional state. I think that her inability to self-regulate leads her to be verbally and physically abusive. I think she, like many people, is not all good or all evil, but rather a complex mixture of light and dark. I can recognize the extraordinary things about her while still recognizing that she is an abuser who is deeply damaging to those who get close to her. I think I learned some valuable lessons from my relationship with her, and there are certain red flags I will never overlook again. I recognize the damage she did to me, and is continuing to do to me, nearly a year after I left, while also recognizing that we did some amazing things together. I think people are complicated.
That's not all of the posts in which Franklin discussed having received abusive and harmful behaviors from a recent ex following the breakup with Eve. There are many more Quora posts alone that paint a similar damning picture. Franklin even did a presentation in November of 2018 at Virtual Big Poly Fun called "My Abuser is Woke: When Abusers Co-opt Social Justice Language." Very subtle. Now, because she has since deleted her account, I am not able to do the same kind of deep dive into her Quora account on Eve's side as I did Franklin's. If I go to her blog, there is this post that claims to have been originally posted on Quora on September 28th, 2018. In it, Eve talks about Brett Kavanaugh and notes some similarities between him and her ex. If I just go off of her Facebook posts following the time of the breakup, which I did do my best to thoroughly go through, there really aren't that many references to Franklin. She mentions him sort of like in passing, like when talking about going to a seminar for the first time without him, and references him as that guy when discussing the release of Black Iron. There are two posts in particular I might infer she was talking about Franklin, one in which she is talking about how there is no true definition of a polyamorous expert, and another in which she claims she doesn't really identify as polyamorous anymore due to inherent toxic elements within the community. But even then, she doesn't make the same sort of direct reference or accusations to Franklin in the same manner that he was clearly doing to her. And you know, dear viewers, if that was the end of the information updates we had available, I'd probably wrap things up here. A sad and disappointing ending to be sure, but one that would leave little room for interpretation. One of our polyam elders, and a man at that, experienced abuse at the hands of a partner. But, as you can probably surmise from the tone of my voice and the length of this video, that was not the end of it. Not by a long shot. But before we go forward, let's go back a bit. Throughout 2018, 3 posts would appear on 3 different websites written either anonymously or under pseudonyms. The next one was posted on Medium on July 28th, and another, on anger management, was posted on Our Better Natures on November 8th. The first appeared on March 27th, 2018 on KellySundberg.com, Kelly Sundberg being an author and domestic violence survivor who writes about abuse. It was called, "It Was Never About the Nail."
Gaslighting isn't a single incident. It's a pattern of tiny, often barely perceptible instances of erasure, minimizing, confusion, deflection. Nails, beams, boards, tiles, wire. Piece by piece, a house is built. The door is closed and you're inside, and you hear the construction around you, but somehow no one sees. You try to tell him, you point to the ceiling, the walls, the furniture. "Why are you so upset?" he asks. "That's just a chair." You try to show him how the pieces fit together, how they make a house. "So it's about the beams," he says. "No, it's not about the beams." You try again. Oh, so this is really about the tiles. What's wrong with the tiles? Explain. Another nail goes in. Your ears are sensitive now from the months of construction around you, and you wince in pain at the noise. You ask him to stop hammering in nails. I don't understand, he says. It's just a nail. It's not even that loud. I think this is just your anxiety. You wonder if the house is real. The house grows. He invites people in, hands them tubes of caulk and paintbrushes. You try to explain, you don't want this. They're hurting you, but they're confused. Why are you upset about a paintbrush? You try to describe the walls, but you open your mouth and incoherent noises come out. You can see the house, feel it. But when you try to describe it, there's a hole in your brain. Static. I'm crazy, you think. Maybe they're right. He's a good man. He's trying. He listens. He looks where you point, tries to follow. Words tumble out of your mouth, but he can't see. He doesn't know how. Sometimes you think you see a glimmer of recognition, and you think, we're getting there. And then another nail goes in. It's what he knows after all. And you slip. The good man is a teacher. He gives a talk. People like to hear a good man speak. He's a good man, and he's learned that nails hurt. He wants to own that, to help others. So he describes a nail, talks about what he's learned about nails. At the end of his speech, he passes out hammers and nails. You ask him why. You're hurt, you're angry, you're afraid. They wouldn't understand about the house, he says. It's too hard to explain. You didn't have to give them hammers, you say. You don't need to be so sensitive about nails, he says. He doesn't understand. You want to scream. Why are you so angry? He asks. It's the women who save you. The women who have lived in houses like this. They know the shape of the walls, the corridors, the rooms, the beds, the closets, the basement. They talk with you, help you draw a blueprint, help you see the outlines, walk the hallways with you, locate the doors. Did you know there were doors? Turn on the lights. You see together. It's real, they say. Yes, it's real. We see it. They take your hands, place them on the walls so you can feel them. The house is real. You knew the house was real. It was never about the nail.
The anonymous author would turn out to be Eve Rickert. This post, as well as the rest, would later be updated to give her credit. And It Was Never About the Nail was actually added to her blog on February 23rd, 2019. By the time it was posted there, Eve wasn't the only one speaking publicly about their experiences with construction. Part 2. The Allegations. On February 11, 2019, an article called On Light and Shadow, Franklin Veaux and Polyamory's #MeToo was posted on Medium. In it made the claim that 6 women and non-binary folks had come forward to say that Franklin's version of events was less than truthful regarding past relationships, particularly those featuring nesting partners. Just as a heads up, not everybody that was involved in the situation was originally out as non-binary, so when you look at some of the past articles that I use and some of the references, they still refer to everyone as women. Obviously that isn't accurate, and I did try to update the language in some places, but I know I missed it in others, so just be aware of that as we move forward. Hey everyone, Editing Amanda here. Also, I didn't notice this initially, but when I went to go get screenshots of this article, for some reason, the name of the article has been changed, as well as the fact that every reference specifically to Franklin's name has been removed. It's now referring to him as the author. Not really sure why that happened. I don't know. I've heard that there's some more legal stuff going on between Eve and Franklin. Maybe that has something to do with it. Maybe it doesn't. I'm not sure. But I wrote everything and already had my line readers record their lines and all that you're about to see here in a little bit before I saw that. And I would rather just use what I used and acknowledge that technically I'm not properly quoting the article, as opposed to making everyone redo their lines by saying the author, especially when we all know that the author is Franklin. Like we all know. So you just pretend that everything is in brackets, I guess, or something. This group was seeking a transformative justice process. For those of you who are unaware, this is a way of seeking justice outside of the traditional judicial system, which has historically and disproportionately failed and punished marginalized people. As part of the process, the survivors created a survivor pod, which was made up of people there to help the survivors navigate the process as the allegations came out. The survivor pod was made up of experts, those who were familiar with the transformative justice process, as well as support members. The survivors themselves were not in the survivor pod. That's an important distinction to keep in mind. It might help to think of the survivor pod as being sort of like a group of intermediators, there to help the survivors and work on their behalf while also amplifying their voices. Those accused of harm also have a pod, usually called an accountability pod. They keep them accountable. Yeah, it's in the name. You're smart, you get it. If you're interested in learning more about transformative and restorative justice processes, which technically are two different things, but I'll be honest with you, I'm still trying to learn the difference, then I highly recommend watching this video by Medusa Muse and also giving this article by Teen Vogue a read. Both of those will of course be available in my list of resources in the description box below. In the On Light and Shadow article, the Survivor Pod says,
The people's experiences.
The people's experience.
The people's experiences.
The people's experiences indicate that Franklin has patterns of manipulation,
Gaslighting and lying.
Leverages his multiple partners against one another.
Against one another.
against one another,
Tests or ignores boundaries.
Pathologizes partners' normal emotions.
And weaponizes their mental illnesses.
exploits partners financially,
Uses partners' ideas and experiences in his work without permission or credit.
Without permission or credit.
Without permission or credit. Grooms significantly younger, less experienced, or vulnerable people.
Lacks awareness of power dynamics and consent.
Has involved people in group sex and other sexual activities that they experience as coercive.
As coercive.
as coercive, and accepts no responsibility for the harm he causes by engaging in these behaviors.
Often blaming other people or the harmed individuals themselves for that harm.
These behaviours escalate when Franklin lives with a partner.
And lives with a partner.
Lives with a partner.
And he becomes verbally abusive when his nesting relationships end.
The severity of this pattern is illustrated by the fact that none of his former nesting partners will be alone with him. Two of them,
Two of them.
Two of them, over a decade apart, fled the homes they shared with him at the end of their relationships.
Their written records from the time of leaving him show evidence of trauma.
the people who have told their stories describe effects on them that range from lingering confusion and self-doubt
All the way to self-harm, suicidal ideation,
Lasting trauma requiring years or decades to repair, and long-lasting.
long-lasting or permanent damage to their ability to trust others,
enjoy intimacy,
Or enter into healthy romantic relationships.
The article also includes a list of requests that includes, but is not limited to,
share this statement,
share this statement,
Share this statement.
Share this statement. And make clear your support for the survivors in this process.
Do not give Franklin a platform to speak as an expert about abuse.
accountability, or transformative justice.
or promote his work on these subjects.
Pay attention.
Pay attention.
Pay attention, ask questions, and read the survivor statements when they're available.
Closely examine the narrative of Franklin and his partners for statements that attempt to define the reality, experience, or feelings of the survivors.
Confront narrative control and manipulation wherever you see it.
We do not want
We do not want
for Franklin or any of his partners to be excluded from their communities or severed from social support.
However, we ask that the safety of survivors be prioritized at events.
which may mean denying Franklin entry upon request to certain events or spaces that survivors wish to attend.
We expect these instances to be rare.
To be rare,
And have only minimal impact on Franklin's access to community.
There's a lot in this article, by the way, including what I think is a very generous acknowledgement of how much good Franklin has done for some parts of the polyamorous world. The Survivor Pod made a point to say,
we are not
We're not requesting a boycott of any of Franklin's published work, and none of the survivors have asked for this. That said, do remain mindful
of the fact that his stories about past relationships
consistently differ from his past partner's experiences to a degree
that goes beyond what can be explained by two people remembering the same events differently.
In May of 2019, 3 of the accounts, Elaine, Celeste, and Amber's, appeared on a website called Polyamory's #MeToo, which was created and maintained by Louisa Leontiadis, an author and immersive journalist. Louisa was brought in by Eve Rickert to carefully interview, compile, and even offer some analysis of these accounts. Originally, this was going towards her master's degree in journalism. By the website's end, it would have 7 accounts from survivors and those who came forward with supporting testimony. Part of what makes those initial 3 accounts so important is that all of these women had appeared in Franklin's memoir, The Game Changer. Their accounts directly and starkly contradicted the image that Franklin had so carefully curated, that of a self-aware, experienced polyam elder who had realized and learned from his past mistakes. Louisa writes,
I have found evidence which indicates discrepancies, revisionist history, and sometimes outright lies. In every single case, it is the woman's version of the stories which are supported by entries on LiveJournal, comment threads, correspondence, or web pages dated from around that time. In every single case, the changes made to their stories benefit Vaux's ethical persona, or are used to better justify ethical stances which together form the cornerstones of his modern polyamorous philosophy.
Eventually, this website would be archived, and the survivors would take direct control of their own narratives, creating a website called I Tripped on the Polyamorous Missing Stair. This website would include complete transcripts of all of the interviews done by Louisa and Kali Tal, another author and trauma scholar, as well as have some of the recordings of the interviews themselves. At time of recording this video, there are now 11 accounts on it. Now, unfortunately, I'm not able to do a full reading of all of the accusations in their full. Some of these accounts are several pages long, and I do have a lot of ground I want to cover afterwards. It is important to me, though, that everybody is represented and heard. So what I will be doing is going through each of these accounts and offering you a sort of highlight reel of the allegations presented. Also, just in case anyone's puckered butt lawyer is watching this right now, these are all allegations that have not been proven in a court of law. In fact, I don't think there's any plans to take Franklin to court over any of these allegations. In order to discuss them, I am using a journalistic standard that was sent to me by one of my script advisors when I was looking for advice on how to properly discuss this. I even had a lawyer review this entire script for me just in case and just to make sure my ass was covered. Okay? Everyone good? Everyone's butthole relaxed? Great. Let's get into it. Let's start with Celeste, Franklin's ex-wife of 18 years, and one of the women who was characterized, rather uncharitably, in both More Than Two and The Game Changer. Franklin had relationships with various women over the years, while he and Celeste maintained a hierarchical structure, one in which she was his primary. That is, until he met Amber. It was at this point that Franklin became dissatisfied with the agreements that he and Celeste had and asked for changes. Celeste says that at this point she began to see him less and less, as Franklin was spending the majority of his free time with Amber instead. Franklin and Amber made plans to move to Boston with another girlfriend of theirs, no plans to take Celeste along with them, which was, understandably to her, pretty frustrating. They began to go to counseling, and it was after one of these sessions that Franklin told Celeste that he wanted to have a divorce. Celeste says she waited about a month for him to do something, and when he didn't, she ended up serving him papers instead, which he yelled at her for. Celeste describes a relationship in which she was essentially a caregiver, receiving little to no thanks for the labor that she put in to maintain their lives, and Franklin's online persona.
I did everything for Franklin. I bought his socks and underwear. He never had to worry about clothes, food. I did all the shopping. I did all the cooking. I did all the cleaning. I called myself Hardware Girl because I would order all the hardware that he needed for him, and whatever he needed, and then I had it delivered. I did everything that I could to keep us in a happy, as much as I could do with working my 8 hours, 36-hour work weeks, and then taking care of him in the evenings. And when he would just want to come home and eat dinner and then go up into his computer room and do whatever it was he wanted.
Eventually, Celeste began dividing up property and finances, creating a safe exit. She also describes a situation in which it felt as though Franklin had threatened her. She fled the house that very night. In the wake of leaving, Celeste says that she traded a violet wand, which for those of you who are not aware is a sort of sex toy, that Franklin was no longer using with her, for a laptop, which angered Franklin quite a bit. Fights about money in particular got rather bitter at times, and Celeste says that Franklin at times would accuse her of trying to steal from him. Interestingly enough, Celeste is the one who seems to have been managing their finances and money when she was there, so when she left, things seem to have gotten tricky for him and Amber. Celeste says that she was stuck paying off the debt she accumulated in that relationship with Franklin for years afterward. I also would like to mention that on Louise's website, she makes a point to say that during the time of being a caregiver to Franklin, Celeste was dealing with a long list of ailments, including diabetes. Elaine and Franklin initially met online when Franklin was looking for someone to test out a game of his in the early 2000s. When he expressed interest in her, Elaine said initially that she would only move forward if she could meet Celeste first. And she did, and they actually became friends. The relationship with Elaine was long distance. She lived in California at the time, so they mainly connected via text, phone, and webcam. Elaine says she began to notice a pattern with Franklin in which he would make decisions or break agreements without consulting Celeste, like, for example, having sex with partners without condoms. She also says that Franklin continued to try and push her into group sex scenarios, which Elaine was not comfortable with. As time went on and Franklin met other partners, it appears that his ability to be a present partner with Elaine seems to have slipped. Elaine became very frustrated with lack of communication and became certain that at times that he was lying to her in the same way that he had been lying to Celeste. Eventually, Celeste, who was upset at seeing her friend being treated that way, invoked veto power to force Franklin to just break up with her, which honestly may have been the most merciful thing to do. In The Game Changer, Franklin claims that they were together for 3 years. Elaine says it was 1. Elaine had this to say about Franklin.
Something is not right. Either what he's reporting about our relationship is not true of him, or what he told me at the time was a lie. Or that he can so well compartmentalize that he can feel things and then completely abandon those beliefs. Because his actions don't prove up his words. And that's always been my complaint with him, is he'll say something and then it's like, well, where's the proof?
Before we get into this account, a quick note. In November 2020, it was revealed that Amber had previously written underneath the pseudonym Shay Emmett Fett, a polyamorous blogger. She also recently started a blog under the name Allie Graves on Medium. Now, I have received word that for this video, she would like to be known as Amber, so that is what I'm going to be referring to her throughout this video. I did want to at least mention the pseudonym thing though, because some of her writings, particularly the ones under Shay about abuse, have been quoted directly by Franklin himself. Amber started dating Franklin when she was 24, 12 years younger than his 36. She says initially that the relationship was very worshipy on her end, but when she moved in with him and Celeste, she found herself feeling trapped, miserable. She says it felt like she was in an emotional hostage situation. Amber describes Franklin as someone who believes that he could never be the cause of his partner's distress, seeing it instead as some kind of byproduct of their hysterical emotions. But he also will offer comfort and support for his partners to get over these emotional outbursts, gaslighting them in the process.
In this way, do you see how the very construct of the relationship will gaslight anyone who is emotionally invested in him and then suffers for it? Because you will always be steered towards believing that the pain is ultimately coming from you. When you know that it wasn't there until he did that thing or didn't do that thing or did that series of things. But because he is now being the kind and loving friend that is helping you through this, it is very difficult to stand strong enough to call him on his actions.
She also says that she does not feel she properly was able to consent to BDSM with Franklin, making it clear that it was due to the difference in age and experience. The relationship ended in 2009. At best, Amber saw Franklin as a friend after that, but Franklin continued to use language like girlfriend and sweetie for her years after the breakup. He referred to her as a long-distance partner in multiple Quora posts, blogs, and interviews. Amber made a point to tell him to his face that he was no longer one of her partners in 2016, which a girlfriend of hers was present for. Despite this, Franklin continued to refer to her as a partner and kept wearing a ring that was meant to symbolize their relationship. Amber had already stopped wearing hers years prior. We're going to talk a little bit more about the end of the communication between the two in Eve's account. She makes a really interesting point about the behavior that I want to end on.
Franklin, he has this image of a confident, smart, poly woman who cares about him deeply enough to step in when he is suffering, but also to never feel insecure or destabilized by his actions, because just has so much self-esteem. So in the beginning, he's looking like, are you the one? Are you the smart, compassionate, insightful, independent, but also codependent woman that I have been looking for? And you're like, OMG, yes, I am that amazing. And while he will kindly accept your flaws for a while, fundamentally, he is holding you up to this warped image where your needs and boundaries and well-being just don't really factor in. It literally does not matter whether he is aware of what he's doing or not in terms of the harm that he's doing. But for what it's worth, I think most abusive men don't know what they are doing. They honestly think their framing of the world is totally fine, which is why they so often feel like the victim.
Lauren dated Franklin from fall of 2006 to late 2011. The relationship was a long-distance one, and Lauren says that at times it seemed like Franklin really struggled to keep his side of the relationship going. He would essentially forget about her, rarely initiating contact, but then be overly affectionate and sweet when they were actually together when he would visit. She says that Franklin was rather inadequate about communicating about new partners, meaning that sometimes she wouldn't find out about him dating someone new until some time later. No apologies ever given, of course. And that thoughtlessness was really frustrating to her, because at the same time that he was doing this to her, he was writing advice to other people telling them not to do that at all. Lauren found herself constantly trying to get Franklin to understand her needs to keep the relationship going, often diminishing her ask each time, until eventually all she was requesting was a single phone call a month. Franklin couldn't even do that. Lauren also shares a story about a threesome with Franklin and another one of his partners, Vera, that sounds like it may have been coerced. During the threesome, Vera became very emotionally distraught at one point and tried to push through for Franklin's sake. And Franklin's reaction to this emotional display? Nothing. He just went cold. Lauren made this very astute observation at the end of her testimony.
He held up his other partners as examples of how secure people behaved. His commitment to rationality led to a lot of development in my thoughts about how rationality sucks as its sole decision-making mechanism, without being informed by emotion and intuition and other things. I always felt I had to justify every need with a purely logical argument, and any failure to get my needs met was basically because I was too hysterical to argue my position properly.
Paula and Franklin dated for about 2 years, initially meeting on OkCupid, although they did share some mutual acquaintances. Paula says that finances were a huge issue in that relationship, she often having to pay for Franklin's travel to come visit her. He would make these promises about how he would come to visit her just as soon as he had the money, but then, when he did, would often go visit other partners instead. There was also an incident in which Franklin violated their agreement to notify her if he fluid bonded with anyone else before they had sex again. According to Paula, their sex life featured a number of highly disturbing stories, mostly relating to Franklin being an unsafe dom, ignoring boundaries, sharing details of their sex life on his blog without her permission, as well as using certain implements like whips incorrectly. He also used needles on her despite her blatantly telling him not to do that.
I have a real paranoia of needles, and he posted about it on LiveJournal with pictures of my back. And he told me, I'm going to do acupuncture needles on you. There's a shiny, irrational trigger and I have to push that button. So he did. And I didn't want it. This was all non-consensual. And he's presenting himself as though he's this end-all be-all of knowledge about sex and kink.
She also says that Franklin gaslit her when she would bring up concerns, and was, much like with Lauren, unable to really support the relationship once things became long distance. She experienced such levels of self-doubt and made to feel so bad at Polly that she experienced suicide ideation. When she broke up with Franklin, she essentially just let the relationship expire, never initiating contact again. Lisa and Joanna, a young couple, met Franklin during a road trip of theirs that caused them to spend some time in Portland, Oregon. At the time, they were each 20, and he was 43. They both say they felt Franklin was being a little pushy in his flirting, and that he bought them alcohol. They ran into him again about 3 months later at a convention, him actually sneaking them into the hotel he was staying at the time. Later that night, he would tweet out about having pet lesbians. They said that he tried to have them use some kind of sex toy, which they ended up declining. Now, prior to the con, Franklin had offered them a place to sleep for the night, but it wasn't until they were there that they realized he meant to share the bed with them. This made them both so uncomfortable that they ended up moving to the chairs instead. The two of them credit the fact that they got through that night safely because of having each other.
And I think it's only because we were together and we've always looked out for each other so much. Yeah. If it had being just one of us, I think it would have gone very differently. We were discussing that last night, of just how we've really just looked out for each other without even really, it comes so naturally. I wouldn't have said 10 years ago, "Oh, I'm protecting you," but it really does. We put each other's needs first.
Right. Were you willing to push down unease that you might have, if I expressed the slightest bit? You're moving heaven and earth to get me out of it, and vice versa.
Yeah.
Thanks.
Melanie and Franklin met in 2009 and were together for about 2 years, during most of which they were long distance. The relationship started off quite heavy and sexual, with Franklin having Melanie perform certain tasks, usually over the phone. Melanie says,
"And I think it just has such an appearance of benignness to it. And I think it's where the sort of the gaslighting manages to be so effective, is because there's a real benign effect to the whole thing, like the turning it on with the cute and the childlike wonder type things. It makes the whole thing feel benign on one level. And so when people are experiencing things that feel wrong or hurtful or, just people are experiencing stuff that feels uncomfortable, there's this sense that, well, it can't be because of him. Because look at how benign he is. He disarms the women he's interested in very quickly and pours it on quite thick with that."
Very early on, Melanie felt like she really couldn't push back against the things that Franklin and his partners would say or do, thinking that because he had more experience, he just knew better about the way things were supposed to be done. He was 8 years older than her, by the way. There is also yet another story of a less than enthusiastic threesome featuring Vera. There was a particularly hard week in which Melanie, a partner of hers, Sylvia, and Franklin all spent some time together at a castle in France. Very quickly, Sylvia and Franklin became rather flirty and were spending a lot of time together. Whenever Melanie tried to assert her own boundaries, they were not properly addressed, and she struggled a lot to be heard during that time. Sometimes when Melanie would bring up her concerns, the response was just to say, "I love you." Melanie and Sylvia broke up about 6 months after moving in together, their own relationship seeming to have some toxic elements within it. While their relationship to each other ended, they did both remain partnered to Franklin. Melanie felt at this point that Franklin was putting very little effort into maintaining the relationship and just didn't seem to really know or care much about how Melanie was faring. This is what eventually would lead to her breaking up with him. In a post-breakup conversation, Melanie says that she told Franklin that she was having difficulty trusting him for claiming to have no idea about the treatment she had been receiving from Sylvia. She quickly became very exasperated at the way that Franklin kept repeating his narrative over hers.
He was getting very frustrated. When I was saying things like, I just wanted you to choose to be with me when you're with me. And then he said, "Oh, so you want me to read your mind for when you want, do you want me to read your mind for when you want to see me?" And it's like, no, I just want you to be the decision maker. And he's like, "Oh, so I need to read your mind." And I've always been confused by that interaction we had. The fact that he couldn't hear what I was saying, because it didn't fit his script or narrative.
Of the accounts, Eve's is by far the one that is the most lengthy and detailed. I'm going to do my best to summarize and highlight a few important bits of it. Eve and Franklin met in 2012 before a lecture that they were both attending. The beginning of their relationship saw high amounts of affection and charisma being piled on. They seemed perfectly compatible, and in retrospect, Eve does say that she feels they moved a bit quickly. The beginning of Eve's account talks about a few strange and at times really frustrating interactions with one of Franklin's other partners, Vera, who we've now seen in a few other accounts. There would be times that Vera would just seem inexplicably upset with Eve. This seems to be because Franklin was waiving responsibilities about failed check-ins or honoring agreements, putting the onus on Eve rather than take responsibility and apologize himself. Eve describes the incident rather early on, in which she says that she told Franklin about a blog post idea that she wanted to write about that he ended up writing instead, and he didn't give her any credit or acknowledgement within the post. They did come to a resolution, but Franklin's confusion over why such a thing would bother her was a bit strange. A bit after this, Franklin actually presented an idea of Eve's about having a polyamorous code of ethics to a panel as if it was his own. And again, when confronted, he expressed a lot of shock and confusion that such a thing would bother her. How Eve describes the writing of More Than Two sounds rather frustrating. There would be times when Franklin promised that he would work on certain sections of the book while away with other partners, and then just wouldn't do so, or would miss scheduled meetings that he had with Eve without actually informing her. He also appears at times to have been easily distracted by social media and texts with other partners. At one point, Eve says she became so frustrated with Franklin's dismissal of her requests that she went into another room to scream in a pillow. Then later, she went into the bathroom where, alone, she ended up punching Franklin's toiletry case, which at the time she believed to be empty. It turned out it wasn't. There was actually a small blue Q-tip holder within it that ended up getting damaged from the punch. When Franklin came after her later, he made it very clear that her going off to process her emotions alone like that was not acceptable to him. Around mid-2015 is when Franklin and Eve began essentially living together, Franklin spending a lot of time at Eve's place in Canada. Eve describes some rather frustrating incidents in which Franklin would essentially demand her attention when she was preoccupied or in the middle of other things. She describes the incident in which she sort of brushed Franklin off in the middle of putting away laundry, something which ended up upsetting him a lot.
And I wish I could remember the words, and I don't, but he was like, it's your body language and your expression. He was just so upset with me about the way I had expressed that boundary to him and thought that I should just know what it was and I should examine my own behavior. And I'm like, I remember, like, this just happened. Like, I remember just smiling and saying, like, hey, I need to finish this thing.
During the European book tour for More Than Two and The Game Changer, Eve was essentially acting as a manager, being on top of itineraries and scheduling and making sure they got to their hotels on time. At one point, Franklin actually invited another one of his partners, Sylvia, to join them, without consulting Eve first. Now, initially, Eve did try to find some way to fit Sylvia into things, but unfortunately it was going to interfere with the one chance that she had to relax during this tour. So she ended up having a conversation with Franklin about her needs and limitations. According to her, Franklin said that he understood and that he would take care of it. Then he told Sylvia, Eve doesn't want you to come. Sylvia and Eve ended up having a rather serious argument because of this. In 2016, Franklin officially moved to Canada to live with Eve, and the two of them merged their businesses. It's also a little bit after this time that Franklin ended up becoming engaged to one of his partners, Amy. Not Amy Guerin, by the way, this is a different Amy. Around this time, Eve describes struggling quite a bit to keep the businesses she and Franklin had started afloat without his help. He was increasingly spending more and more time on Quora and was also gone a lot traveling. While Franklin and Amy planned their wedding, well, probably just Amy, let's be real, Eve was sometimes getting conflicting and confusing statements from Franklin about the state of things. He sometimes made it seem like, according to her, that he didn't really want to go through this wedding, but was getting pressured from Amy to do so. There were plans for a big group orgy of some kind after the ceremony, but Eve wasn't really comfortable with attending, and so she considered not staying there for the night. After having a conversation with Franklin, it was decided that she would attend, and that later she and Franklin would go to a concert nearby so that they could celebrate their 5-year anniversary together. She ended up buying the tickets. At the wedding, Eve says that she hit her breaking point when a song that was meant to represent her and Franklin's relationship played on the music playlist. She and Franklin ended up having a rather heated argument, reaching a particularly bad low point when she discovered that Franklin had already made plans to spend time with another partner, at the same time that he had already promised to go to the concert with her to celebrate their 5-year anniversary.
I felt trapped. So we're on the bed and he's to my left and the side of the van is to my right, and I started pounding my hand against the side of the van, and I think at one point I pounded my hand on the mattress next to me, and he looks up at me and he's like, "You just hit me," because his hand had been under the covers on the mattress where I'd pounded my hand, and I was like, oh my God, I just hit my partner. Holy shit, what have I done? And then that spiral in my head got even worse, and I was like, what am I doing? I'm being violent. And I was so horrified and ashamed of what I'd just done. I started apologizing and begging for his forgiveness and crying.
A question. Do you actually think you hit him?
I believe well, I don't know. I mean...
Did you feel his hand when you smacked down on the bed? Did you feel his hand?
No. So I don't know. I don't know.
The next morning, Eve dropped Franklin off at a hotel where his crush was staying and drove herself home. It's during this drive that she describes having feelings of depression and self-doubt, that became so extreme that at one point she was dealing with suicide ideation and thoughts of actually committing herself to a psychiatric ward. At the beginning of 2018, Eve describes having a bit of a struggle in keeping the business afloat, missing important deadlines and such. She kept requesting for Franklin to sit down with her so that they could go over everything together, and he kept refusing, increasing her sense of isolation. Eve says she decided to take an anger management course because Franklin continued to criticize her for the way that she would express her anger. Interestingly enough, a lot of the tips that they gave in this class, things like going into another room and screaming into the pillow, or even punching things by yourself, were things she had tried previously, but Franklin had discouraged her from doing. Eve suggested that she and Franklin go see a counselor together, which he agreed to do. She says that a friend and neighbor was the one that mediated this talk, which unfortunately didn't go very well. Franklin deflected quite a bit and also tried to blame much of what had happened on Eve's anxiety, claiming that it made it difficult for him to understand her. According to Eve, this friend continued to push back against Franklin's narrative, to question and challenge his version of events, and even at times asked him to be quiet so that Eve could speak. Eventually, Franklin got so upset that he abruptly left the room, seemingly offended that he would be questioned in such a manner. Now we're up to mid-March 2018, the end of the relationship. On the 12th, Eve decided to leave the house to go stay with a friend and ended up emailing Amber. The two of them had a conversation, comparing notes about their relationships with Franklin. Now, Amber hadn't experienced everything that Eve was describing, but there were still enough similarities that sounded all too familiar. Eve ended up telling Franklin that she was talking to Amber. It was during this conversation that Franklin ended up asking Eve if Amber was breaking up with him. When Eve relayed this information to Amber, Amber told Eve that she had not considered Franklin a partner for quite some time, which of course is something that we actually talked about previously in Amber's account. Eve says that at a session with her counselor on March 15th, Franklin made the claim that she had screamed at him during their stay at the cabin during the writing of More Than Two, and frequently had issues with anger management. He said he had to gaslight her because he was afraid of telling her the truth, and even kept his phone on silent so as not to anger her. Eve, no longer feeling safe, told Franklin that she wanted him to move out, and he agreed. She continued to stay with a friend while he finalized his moving arrangements to get back to Portland, Oregon. She says it took a week before she could sleep in that house after he left. After this, Amber ended up laying down a strong boundary with Franklin that she no longer wanted contact with him, specifically for him continuing to call her a partner so long after their breakup. Franklin would later use this to create the narrative that Eve was turning people against him. After Franklin's leaving, Eve says there were a number of incidents in which members of Franklin's polycule and extended network would block her, write blog posts about her that were filled with blatant lies, or else would share messages she had sent in confidence with Franklin himself. Even Franklin had a mediation of sorts to go over some legal and immigration matters that was rather taxing in May, Franklin at times being rather verbally abusive. In June is when Eve issued Franklin his formal layoff notice. In the following months, while Franklin was writing his numerous Quora posts, Eve discovered that for the first year they were living together, Franklin hadn't told Vera. And that's when she realized that there was a lot about Franklin's partners and their version of events that she just didn't know.
So I started to reach out to some of his other exes and asked if they would talk to me about their experiences because I had spent so much time immersed in his story. It's not just that he was my partner, like I was his editor and his publisher and his co-author, and like I had lived and breathed his story for so long that to have it sort of start to fall apart was really mind-bending. And I just felt like I had to understand what was real. Like I had to get to the bottom of it. And to get to the bottom of it, I had to talk to the other women. I talked to like 8 women eventually. All of them, only one of them didn't consider it to be a bad experience in her life. 1 woman of 8.
Of the testimonies, Rose's is a bit of a standout in that they do not feel that their relationship with Franklin was harmful or abusive. They made a point to even say that. However, I do want to make sure that they're included since they are on the website. Also, some of the details of their account kind of help to show the way that Franklin's narratives are a bit inconsistent from person to person when you actually examine the facts. Franklin and Rose met in February of 2015 at a polyamorous conference, staying pretty consistently in touch with each other for about 3 weeks afterwards. Rose said that they found Franklin's energy to be intoxicating and really enjoyed the emotional and high-intensity conversations that they had together. Occasionally, Franklin would mention some of his other partners, Eve in particular, being uncomfortable with the relationship due to jealousy. He never really asked Rose, though, for any help processing this or anything, so for the most part, they just kind of assumed that he had it handled. He was a polyamorous expert after all. In March, Franklin requested a video call with Rose, during which he ended up breaking up with them. He cited that his partners had become very uncomfortable once they realized the huge age difference between the two of them. Franklin was 48 at the time, and Rose was 26. Now, it is important to note that Rose says that at this point it's kind of hard to call it a true breakup because they hadn't really solidified what a relationship was between the two of them. While Franklin said that it was his decision, he put a lot of emphasis on how his partners were feeling. In 2018, Rose and Eve ended up comparing notes and realized there were a lot of inconsistencies in what Franklin had told the two of them. It turned out he was really downplaying the relationship to Eve, making it sound like Rose was a bit more of just like some kind of fan that was imposing themselves on him. On Rose's Facebook page, they wrote,
"In being able to observe things Franklin has published that are directed at partners or exes of his, I have no doubt in my mind that he's capable of abuse. I've seen him talk in condescending ways to partners or exes and try to make them look stupid in old forum posts. I've seen the way he acts and reacts to the work being done now in trying to name harm he has done. These are things I've watched him say under his own name, aside from any stories any of the survivors have told me. I believe this man is dangerous, and I believe the non-monogamy and BDSM communities need to take these stories and accounts very seriously. I believe the survivors."
Now, Marissa was also mentioned in Eve's account, but because they have their own story about dealings with Franklin, I decided to keep that part out of Eve's bit and just sort of fill in the details here instead. Marissa met Frank when he was promoting The Game Changer, the two of them meeting through a mutual friend. It started off as a friendship that involved lots of texting and supportive messages going back and forth. At the time, Marissa was in a not-so-healthy relationship, and so much of that conversation that they were having was really Franklin just showing them support. Marissa says that they were never interested in Franklin in a sexual or romantic way. There's an incident in which Marissa says that Franklin asked Marissa to teach one of his partners erotic hypnosis. While Marissa did initially agree to that, the group text that he started and ended up becoming quickly much more sexual than Marissa was comfortable with. And it was certainly not something they had agreed to. After Eve and Franklin broke up, Marissa was told Franklin's version of events, which included some less than charitable descriptions of Eve. Later on, Eve actually ended up getting in touch with Marissa because she had heard that Franklin had gone to the hospital and wanted to make sure that he had proper insurance and all that such. So the two of them ended up coordinating to make sure that Franklin got proper care. Marissa says,
"Basically, it didn't connect. What he was saying about her did not connect at all to the way that she was acting to me, and she seemed very normal and caring, trying to make sure he had medical attention. And he was just it was very strange the way that he was acting. And so at one point, I just remember saying to him, like, why? I think there's miscommunication. I think there's something going on. I think you guys just need to talk to each other." As soon as he knew that I was talking to Eve, he started shutting down and getting very upset that she had contacted me at all. And he seemed to be getting angry that she was telling me anything. And then ultimately ended up not talking to me, but we just stopped contacting each other.
Following this incident, Eve and Marissa ended up having a conversation about Franklin, during which Eve made a point to say that she knew Marissa was in love with Franklin, which was news to Marissa. Specifically, Franklin had told Eve that Marissa had asked him to dominate them, a conversation which Marissa says never happened. He had even made a point to tell Eve that he had used boundaries to keep Marissa in line, and Eve was able to back these up with screenshots that she showed to Marissa. Now, understandably, Marissa was pretty upset about this and ended up cutting off all contact with Franklin. And that concludes the survivor and supporting person's testimonies. Now, that was a lot of highly disturbing information, and I don't know about you, but I could take a moment to maybe sit and sort of let everything settle. And while we're doing that, let's talk about a super light subject. What abuse is. I'm gonna need my coloring books. Part 3. Let's talk about abuse. I have been swimming in abuse research now for about a full year, read multiple books, articles, and studies. There's a lot of things in particular that I really want to make sure that we touch on in this section. There are many ways to be abusive, physically, of course, yes, but there's also emotional, sexually, and even financially. And most abusers are going to be spread over a couple of different types of abuse, so you don't necessarily stick to one category. For the purposes of this video, we are going to be mostly focused on emotional abuse. Emotional abuse is about undermining the target's sense of self, their emotional well-being, and very mental health. Abusers do this in the hopes that that person will become more dependent on them, trusting them and getting their sense of worthiness from the abuser. Emotional abusers do things like creating chaos, such as creating multiple scheduling conflicts that they then refuse to deal with, but will expect their partners to. They will invalidate their partner's feelings, often telling them that their emotions are too much or disproportionate to the act being done, or mock their victims outright. By the way, this is definitely not a fully comprehensive list of everything that does and does not qualify for abuse, and I am not an expert myself. I read the expert opinion of other people in order to sort of inform this list. I think, though, this helps to sort of differentiate between, someone just being a bit of an asshole, maybe bad at dating, and actual perpetuators of abuse. Abusers are rarely a one-and-done bunch. It's typically more of a pattern of behaviors, one that can span over multiple years and relationships. I don't really think it's possible for someone to be abusive a single time, and honestly, I do sometimes roll my eyes a little bit when somebody is quick to, call a harmful behavior abuse automatically. When we expand our scope looking at the person who hit a partner a single time, we tend to find other abusive behaviors, even if not physical. These things do tend to progress over time, as well as other concerning signs. When comparing multiple instances of abuse around a single perpetrator, we tend to notice a lot of similarities. For example, starting off a new relationship very emotionally heightened and affectionate.
He disarms the women he's interested in very quickly, and pours it on quite thick with that.
That eventually stops, sometimes rather abruptly, only to then see that person do the same with the next partner. Celeste says that at this point she began to see him less and less, as Franklin was spending the majority of his free time with Amber instead. Sometimes the similarities that we see in abusive patterns aren't exactly the same, but share a kind of flavor, if you will. For example, someone's inability to respect boundaries in one relationship might look like,
I'm going to do acupuncture needles on you. There's a shiny, irrational trigger and I have to push that button.
But in another may look like, while Marissa did initially agree to that, the group text that he started and ended up becoming quickly much more sexual than Marissa was comfortable with. Most abusers have a very difficult time owning up to their actions. They will deflect, they'll make up excuses, and will manipulate facts as much as possible to make themselves seem like the rational party.
I always felt I had to justify every need with a purely logical argument, and any failure to get my needs met was basically because I was too hysterical to argue my position properly.
Apologies are used often as manipulation and aren't really sincere, and/or is used as a last-ditch effort in order to make the abused person stay, usually while using highly manipulative language that forces the harmed individual to actually have to comfort the abuser. Now, this isn't to say that abusers can never reform or actually own up to the harm that they've done, but it is something that takes a lot of work and is not typically rectified with just a simple apology. And I am typically speaking more of the behaviors that we see while they're still in an abusive relationship and not later when they've actually been confronted with the harm that they've done. Sometimes when Melanie would bring up her concerns, the response was just to say, I love you. Sometimes abusers may be willing to apologize, readily so, but there's rarely any long-lasting changes to the behavior. They'll apologize, make a show of contrition for at least a little while, but then eventually start slipping back into those behaviors again. In more public situations, an abuser may make a big show of apologizing to their victims, but in reality, these are actually not sincere efforts to be held accountable, but rather a measure to save their reputation.
Think of literally any time a YouTuber has fucked up and done a public apology video.
Victims of abuse will carry the impact of that for a long time, maybe even the rest of their lives. There are some interesting studies about the link between abuse and physical health. Now, I should mention that the science isn't in complete agreement about this. There's a lot of factors to keep in mind. Even just how the studies themselves are conducted can affect the outcome. With that said, I did find a few studies that showed evidence that there is a stronger correlation with people with abuse and other trauma in their history of having higher negative health effects, including chronic health issues and mental illness. She experienced such levels of self-doubt and made to feel so bad at Polly that she experienced suicide ideation. The aftermath of abuse has no timeline. It may take 1 year before they fully understand all of the ways that abuse actually altered them. While still in the relationship, loved ones may find that they are quite different from the way they typically are, perhaps more prone to emotional outbursts or shutting down completely. They may even lash back out at their abuser.
He looks up at me and he's like, "You just hit me," because his hand had been under the covers on the mattress where I'd pounded my hand, and I was like, oh my God, I just hit my partner. Holy shit, what have I done?
I think we also should take a moment to discuss the way that power dynamics can show up in abusive relationships, specifically the way that age and status can intersect. When someone is perceived to be more knowledgeable in a subject, say BDSM or relationships, they tend to be on a sort of pedestal, and they may not be questioned as often about how ethical or correct they actually are, especially if they're telling younger individuals with less status and less experience that they are in the right. Sometimes abusers specifically look for younger individuals because they are more easily manipulated. Amber started dating Franklin when she was 24, 12 years younger than his 36. Franklin was 48 at the time, and Rose was 26. At the time, they were each 20, and he was 43. Now let me be clear, I am not saying that every relationship with some kind of age difference or where one person has a certain celebrity that the other one does not is automatically abusive. I am not saying that. Do not put words in my mouth. I prefer other things going in there. But I think it's extremely naive to pretend as if there couldn't be some kind of potential power dynamic or leverage when a relationship has one person who, say, is in their mid-age range while the other one is still in their early 20s. An older partner is in the position of potentially shaping the expectations and ideas of that younger, inexperienced counterpart. Add in any kind of celebrity the person had, or if the other individual started off essentially as a fan, and that can make pushing back against behaviors that maybe feel a little off much harder to do. Very early on, Melanie felt like she really couldn't push back against the things that Franklin and his partners would say or do, thinking that because he had more experience, he just knew better about the way things were supposed to be done. There are some specific ways that abuse tends to rear its ugly head within polyamorous relationships specifically. The amazingly detailed article Confronting Abuse in Polyamorous Relationships makes a point to mention that abusers tend to blame their problematic behaviors on other partners, the abused person's metamours.
Abusive partners may have to adapt their rhetoric and behavior to maintain the pretext that they act based on shared values surrounding open relationships. Because of this, an abusive partner may contextualize much of their controlling, isolating, or criticizing behavior as a reaction to a problematic metamour. In this way, the abuser diverts attention from the true source of the issue and makes it less likely that the abused partner will go to the metamour for help.
There would be times that Vera would just seem inexplicably upset with Eve. This seems to be because Franklin was waiving responsibilities about failed check-ins or honoring agreements, putting the onus on Eve rather than take responsibility and apologize himself. Another interesting pattern in abusive polyamorous relationships is how gaslighting is implemented. For those of you who don't know, gaslighting is essentially when an abuser will undermine a victim's grasp of reality and actually replace it with the abuser's version. This can be the abuser asserting their own interpretations of the abused feelings and intentions on them, or using the abused ideals against them. Sometimes gaslighting is overly simplified as being essentially lying, but it's a lot more sinister and complex than that. In polyamorous relationships, gaslighting can show up when the victim notices problematic behaviors, but the abuser then tells them that they just need to better manage their jealousy.
Abusers may assert the importance of getting along with metamours, owning your feelings, and refraining from zero-sum games in order to convince an abused person that their resistance to abusive behavior is actually a manifestation of jealousy or selfishness.
Because you will always be steered towards believing that the pain is ultimately coming from you.
The same article makes a point to mention that sometimes the negative behavior a person may receive from other members of the polycule or their relationship network is actually a result of those people being abused themselves.
In polyamory in particular, a new person entering a relationship may encounter hostility, or negativity from a metamor as the result of an existing dynamic of abuse from the shared partner. In these situations, hostile, abusive, or negative behavior may not be rooted in someone's desire to control the other people in the situation, but rather part of a fight for control of themselves.
Some red flags to be on the lookout for is avoidant rather than confrontational behavior, as well as triangulation. Triangulation is when a perpetual of abuse will actually create narratives that make metamors less likely to befriend and trust each other. Occasionally, Franklin would mention some of his other partners, Eve in particular, being uncomfortable with the relationship due to jealousy. DARVO is an acronym that stands for Deny, Attack, and Reverse Victim and Offender. It was first coined by Jennifer Fried in her 1997 article, Violations of Power, Adaptive Blindness, and Betrayal Trauma Theory.
I hypothesize that if an accusation is true, and the accused person is abusive, the denial is more indignant, self-righteous, and manipulative than denial in other cases. Similarly, I've observed that actual abusers threaten, bully, and make a nightmare for anyone who tries to hold them accountable or asks for a change in their abusive behavior. This attack, intended to chill and terrify, typically includes threats of lawsuits, overt and covert attacks on the whistleblower's credibility, and so on. The more the offender is held accountable, the more wronged the offender claims to be. The offender accuses those who hold him accountable of perpetuating acts of defamation, false accusations, smearing, etc. The offender is on the offense, and the person attempting to hold the offender accountable is on the defense.
Now, I do want to make sure I acknowledge that every study on DARVO that I read made a point to mention that it still requires more study. In the scientific community, anything that hasn't been studied thoroughly for 50 to about 100 years is still considered new. With that said, as I was reading Fried's hypothesis and the surrounding research, I was surprised by just how eerily familiar it all sounded. And I'm curious to see if you all think so too. DARVO is a manipulation tactic. It's a way of reshaping and twisting the narrative into one that leaves you with more sympathy for the alleged abuser, while simultaneously making the victim seem less credible, maybe even like the actual abuser themselves. There are lots of ways to implement DARVO, and it can make it much harder to recognize who the actual perpetuator of harm even is in these situations. There are a few important distinctions to be on the lookout for. For one thing, how victims and abusers tend to discuss their alleged abuser is remarkably different. For one thing, actual victims of abuse tend to show a lot of guilt for their own behaviors, and also empathy for their abuser's struggles, showing concern for their well-being.
This stands in stark contrast to an abuser, who tends to craft a narrative that reduces the abused to some form of monster, master manipulator, or hysteric who is wholly responsible for the conflict, and above all, not to be believed. Some abusers may feign sympathy to garner moral superiority or suggest a character flaw. For example, poor thing, they clearly have mental issues. Their drinking does such terrible things to them. They're obviously still bitter. But the focus of the conversation tends to return again and again to the injustice of the other person's behavior and the abuser's suffering.
I think she is a remarkable, extraordinary woman with a lot going for her, who also has a very serious anger management issue and has, unfortunately, not learned good strategies to deal with her emotional state.
It's also important to note that one's race, gender, and other such factors can play into this as well. A victim who is a woman may be seen as less reliable if she is too, or not enough, emotional. Her male perpetuator of harm, on the other hand, might be seen as being so brave and praised for his vulnerability, cheered for being so passionate in his denial. I honestly had a really hard time talking and coloring at the same time, but I did get a little more of the tale done. It's just a lot of cock for me to handle. Part 4. Franklin's response to the allegations.
My abusive ex had a bunch of her friends, and some folks I used to consider friends, draft a letter accusing me of abuse. Since I left the relationship a year ago, I've been doing everything in my power to stay clear of my abusive ex, and she's been doing everything in her power to try to hoover me back in. I want no contact with her, but she does not want to let go of me. She's done a lot of things to try to keep me. For example, I had a phone number on her account, at her insistence, which she refused to let go of. I had to change my phone number and get a new phone to get away from her. That's the kind of thing she's doing to try to continue to make me engage with her. Her latest strategy is sending a letter, signed by many of her friends, accusing me of harming her and calling on me to participate in restorative justice with her. I don't want anything to do with her. I want to be gone. She keeps doing everything in her power to make me continue to engage with her, and the only thing I want is to be left alone. Ironically, many of the people who signed this letter also helped silence a previous ex of hers who also reported being abused by her.
That was originally posted by Franklin right after he received the Colin letter, which is actually what prompted the Medium article on Light and Shadow to be released publicly the next day. Now, that post has since been deleted by Franklin, but I do think it is important to highlight, but it's going to prepare you for how he's handled the situation. There is no recognition of wrongdoing, doubling down, lots of counter accusations, dirty deletes up the wazoo, not to mention a whole choir of tiny little violins playing under every single word. Allegedly. In a now also deleted Facebook post that came the day after the Medium article went public, Franklin makes the claim that he's starting an accountability pod. But, well, let's take a look.
I've recently received a Colin letter less than 24 hours before a public statement went out. I intend to participate in this process to the best of my ability, and I'm in the process of creating a pod now. This is, as you can imagine, taking a bit of time as I want to ensure there are people who are both able to be objective about the situation and whom I can trust to hold me to my core principles throughout. I look forward to seeing what I can learn to do better and how I can help heal any wounds I may have unknowingly contributed. The details of the concerns of those who wish me to respond have not been made available to me yet. I cannot begin the process of dealing with things until they have been stated or shared. But I understand that this lack of clarity is as frustrating to you all as it is anxiety-producing to me. I am still gathering my thoughts as I process the situation as well, so I'll have more to say in a week or so. Thank you to those of you who have supported me in my learning journey over the years, as well as those who are currently withholding judgment until we all find out the details of what the concerns are, and I have had a chance to respond.
Okay, so number one, the fact that he uses Colin letter in quotes, not a great sign, because, you know, it was a Colin letter. Like, there's no reason to put that in quotes, Franklin. It comes off really sarcastic and dismissive. The fact that he talks about being held to his core set of principles and finding people he can trust to be objective also isn't very satisfying. Because, I mean, you know, clearly there's something wrong with your core set of principles, Franklin, or else we wouldn't be here. Like, that's literally what's in question right now. The thing that strikes me most about this are the emotions expressed. There's confusion over the specific allegations, anxiety and trepidation over, you know, wondering what's going to happen next, as well as gratitude being expressed for all the people that are still standing with Franklin. You know what I don't see, though? Remorse. He makes this kind of looking forward to better myself statement, but in no way actually takes responsibility or acknowledges that he may have done any harm. This is not, in my opinion, the post of someone who actually believes they did anything wrong. This reads much more as the statement of a public figure telling his fans and followers that he has seen the allegations and is just asking for patience during this difficult time. For him. There are other posts and comments from Quora showing Franklin being rather dismissive about the seriousness or validity of these accounts, including this comment.
Is there any truth behind the 6 women testified? Or is it just a fabrication?
I have absolutely no idea. If there are 6 women, I have no clue who they are. The article doesn't name them, nor does it describe the harm I did to them.
I'd invite you all to take a drink every time Franklin puts a random word in quotes, but I don't want those deaths on my hands. There were many other Quora and Facebook posts, now all deleted, following the months and then year after the allegations, almost all of them making counter accusations. In June of 2020, Franklin released a blog post called Breaking My Silence. Silence? Here's a few highlights from this Silence-breaking post.
I still can't talk about my experience with Eve without centering or referencing her. Our relationship revolved around her experiences, her feelings, her desires. I have been trying for over a year now to work out how to talk about my experiences, and it just keeps coming out as a story about Eve and what she did and what she wanted from me. Part of this was my fault. I have always allowed other people to write over me. Someone had always taken care of me. I am only just now getting a peek into how big a problem this was, thanks to my current partners, painstakingly, in excruciating detail and with the help of my therapist, explaining my privilege to me. Even this is a symptom of my privilege, that I have people who have been socialized as women around me taking the time and energy to chip away at my blindness, even as they receive social penalties for continuing to associate with me. I've spent a lot of time with my therapist unpacking how I could allow another person to so distort my sense of reality. Part of it is that Eve is extremely gifted with manipulating the language of social justice. She was able to take me to a place where I believed things that weren't true without technically lying. The constant anxiety, that repeated raising and crushing of hope, the ongoing stress of the last year and a half has burned out all the energy I had left to fear loss. I'm done. There's nothing left for me to lose. So I'm choosing truth. I'm choosing vulnerability. I'm choosing openness and courage and hope. I'm choosing to reach out to my community. I'm choosing not to be silent anymore. I haven't dared take that risk before now.
You say things! This narrative, Franklin being forced into silence by Eve and the other survivors, is a false one, completely proven false by his own words. He was never completely silent. He shared his version of events multiple times across multiple platforms and social media before the allegations even came out. And after they did, he continued to do that. He just deleted a bunch of them. The notion that he was ever too afraid to speak out against Eve in itself is just so laughable to me, considering how quickly he came out against her with allegations. He literally did a presentation called "My Abuser is Woke." Wow, such bravery to speak up again now after profiting off of your narrative. Oh, I also just want to point out that that blog post makes a point to start with a quote from Amber under the Shay pseudonym. The following month, Franklin appeared on, and I can't believe I have to actually say this out loud, the Man Horror Podcast with host Billy Procida, and it was more of the same.
I believe that Eve is an abuser. I believe that Eve is physically abusive. I believe that she is emotionally abusive. I believe that she is economically abusive. And I believe that she is verbally abusive.
Yeah, this is really hard to listen to. The interview equals about 2 hours. It's spread across 2 episodes, and I had to listen to it multiple times. Type F in the comments below, please. To his credit, Billy does actually try to get Franklin to acknowledge the other survivors multiple times, which Franklin continually twists out of. And at one point, Franklin says this.
I actually stopped reading the stories after I hit one that I thought was absolutely, positively 100% false from begin to end. And so I was just like, you know what? This is ridiculous.
In my opinion, this really shows that Franklin never believed it was possible for even a second that he actually caused harm to any of these people. Because in Franklin's mind, his version of the truth is fact, logical, objective. Anything outside of that is emotional, hysteria-driven, the made-up stories of a group of people gathered together by the true villain of the story. He does this thing throughout the podcast interview with Billy where he won't ever blatantly call the survivors liars, but he makes it clear that's exactly what he's thinking.
Will say that I don't remember things the way they are currently being described, that not everything they're saying is factually correct. My memory of events doesn't necessarily align perhaps with what they are saying. I don't think that they are deliberately setting out to lie. There are things in those survivor stories that are factually, demonstrably untrue. Amber has the stories that I do not believe are true are Amber's stories. So I look at those and I'm like, that really isn't the way I remember it. And like I said, I do believe that there are things that are in those stories that are just factually incorrect.
Do you feel like there were people there who genuinely wanted to call you on your shit, help you be a better Franklin?
I think there are people who told themselves that.
Flames on the side of my face.
I believe it was Abigail Thorne that once called this pulling a Jordan Peterson. It's when you lead people to a certain conclusion and you gesture at the thing, but you stop short of actually saying it. But we all know what you're trying to say, dude, and honestly it just makes you look more like an asshole. Abigail didn't say that part. That's me. He also makes this point.
Honestly, it's a little shitty to have somebody strip you of the community that you helped to build, and that actually, I think, was her intent.
It seems like you still have the community. I mean, you have people who do not like you, but there's still clearly, from your own mission, like plenty of people on Quora. There's these conferences. There's still people who want your opinion, who want your voice. You still have community. So
yes, I don't have nearly as much as I used to, but yes, I do still have community.
Which I think is one of the most telling parts of the whole interview. In Franklin's mind, the mere idea that he has now less of an audience, oh, I'm so sorry, I mean community, is what makes this the real tragedy. Not that he might have caused harm to some people, that people who he supposedly once loved are now dealing with the trauma of having once dated him. Oh no. It's that poor Whittle Franklin has less of a community than he used to. Never mind, the Survivor Pod made a point to mention that they still wanted him to have that, just to no longer take up a leadership position. But Franklin seems to have a hard time reading things to their conclusion, so maybe he missed it. And certainly Franklin is not the only one to ever confuse community with platform. There are some parts in this podcast where Franklin acknowledges having made previous mistakes and not being perfect in all his relationships. But they don't really line up with the things that the survivors are bringing to light. It's stuff like being bad at maintaining boundaries or divorcing Celeste. Basically, he's only willing to admit wrongdoing if it's something that he has taken control of the narrative on and deemed a worthy offense, not the ones that are being brought to him. I do have more things I want to say about this interview, as well as just other responses Franklin has made to the allegations. But there are some other things that we need to talk about first. As the pro YouTubers say, put a pin in that. Let's switch gears and address the elephant herd in the room. What was the wider polyam community doing during this time? I'm gonna need a stronger drink.
Part 5. The polyamory community's response.
Cheers. How a community deals with issues, strikes, and challenges says a lot about it and its values. It can demonstrate its goals and what it's willing to do to protect itself from perceived threats. So how have we, the polyamorous community, known to make a big deal about our abilities to better communicate and to grow and to learn from our past mistakes and just generally being better than those monogamous people, have dealt with the allegations of 11 people against one of our own esteemed elders? Well,
even though I always tend to believe in victims' accounts, I also believe in knowing specific details before forming any kind of personal opinion, and that principles of justice and fairness require seeing problems from as many different perspectives as possible before judging.
If someone's first response is to get offended at an accusation instead of to listen and self-reflect, then that is a red flag to me. Part of a transformative justice framework is realizing that we are all capable of harm. I can't imagine being accused of harm and not listening to the voices of people accusing me, because if I did harm someone, I'd want to reflect, grow, and face justice.
Being bad at communication, cold emotionally, not respecting someone's pain, personally irresponsible, behaving badly after a breakup, etc. Those are things that, in my opinion, may speak to Franklin's inadequacy as a partner. Not things I'd ever justify or endorse, and I'll always try to avoid them in my personal relationships. But can we really call it abuse?
Eve Rickert is a divisive, rude, uncaring woman. She was caustic and strident with me when I simply was asking her a simple question, which she did not even wish to listen to me or could not answer because she ignored me. Here she was in my home and we were feeding her. Anything she has to say about Franklin Vo is wrong with no factual background whatsoever.
Wait, are you his dad?
As someone who has long admired Franklin Vo's work and even blurbed his memoir, I am saddened to learn he has a decades-long track record of gaslighting and financially exploiting his partners, among other things, sharing to help correct the record.
I think it's only fair to hear Franklin's side of things, too. I'm not saying anyone is right or wrong, just that we should hear both sides before passing judgment.
A bit of a mixed bag. Reactions ran the gamut, from shock, rage, fear, even disinterest. Some people were very quick to align themselves to the survivor, even publicly expressing that support. But there was not an insignificant amount of people who either adopted a neutral stance, a sort of wait-and-see mentality, or else expressed a concern that this was actually an example of #MeToo being weaponized against an innocent man. Real original sentiment these days. In her Medium article, My Life Belongs to Me, which is an exploration of the allegations and the reactions to them, Kali Tull says,
Many people in the polyamorous community have chosen sides. The usual arguments have surfaced: denial and minimizing on Franklin's part, along with claims that a woman, Eve or Louisa, is leading a witch hunt. Those who accept the ex-partner testimonies usually point to the number of women who have come forward, the consistency of their testimony, and the risks they were willing to take to testify.
Some of the reactions were honestly a bit baffling, seemingly less concerned about the number and consistency of the testimonies, and instead focused on conspiracy theories. For example, take Stan Hanks, someone who prior to this I honestly hadn't heard of, who made this post on Quora on May 18th, 2019. In it, he reveals that he is part of Franklin's accountability pod. But then he also goes on to say that he doesn't like alternative forms of justice seeking. So, Stan, why are you on the accountability pod? It just seems counterproductive to me if you don't like, your choice, obviously. What else does he have to say?
Franklin previously enjoyed a sterling reputation as one of the straight shooters, the good guys in a field for which that was not necessarily the norm. We've seen plenty of narratives where popular figures have fallen due to #MeToo claims, which revealed that they were, in point of fact, not who they appeared to be, yet used the public perception to provide air cover which discredited anyone coming forward with claims. There is a non-zero probability that this is true for Franklin as well. As a pod, we hold Franklin accountable for his actions and for modifying his behavior as necessary. We also have to hold those with claims against him accountable to not make false claims.
The whole tone of this post is honestly really condescending to me, and that might be why it was eventually deleted. Hanks also makes the bold claim of there potentially being false, allegations in the mix, but then doesn't do anything to back that up or give any evidence. He just says it. He would do really well in certain corners of YouTube, come to think of it. Another focus for some community members has been on how the justice-seeking process has progressed, poking any holes into credibility that they can, which has mostly meant criticizing Louisa. Dr. Elizabeth Sheff, also known as Dr. Eli, is an academic expert on polyamory and has done a lot of research specifically on non-monogamous families. She wrote this post on her website called Sociological Analysis of 3 VO Survivor Narratives, and posted it on her website on May 29th, 2019. She makes a point to mention at the beginning that she is in Franklin's accountability pod, but that she is not focusing her analysis through a restorative justice framework. How does this pod of Franklin works if everyone just doesn't seem to like restorative? Do you all know what an accountability pod is? After doing a rundown of the harmful behaviors being alleged, noticeably softening the language in a few places, Dr. Eli gives a list of recommendations for Franklin to help address the situation. They are to listen and seriously consider the narratives of these women, pushing past his own feelings. Okay, good. To make a public statement addressing the allegations, owning the harm he has done without making counter-accusations. She's a bit late with that one. And to disengage with Eve Rickard or anyone who could be financially benefiting from a relationship with Eve. Remember that money thing? We're gonna talk about that more later. Dr. Eli goes on to offer criticisms of how Louisa gathered data, asserting that she was asking leading questions of respondents, and also wasn't asking enough follow-up questions.
The lack of follow-up questions is problematic because failing to ask where information comes from leaves third-hand allegations as seemingly factual information, not allowed in journalism or academia. Furthermore, without knowing the women's specific motivations or what they saw as their active choices, it is hard to know the source of power Franklin used over them.
I find something particularly unsettling about this analysis. Dr. Eli is calling into question Louisa's ability and character. She's saying, well, yes, these people believe this, but Louisa, Louisa didn't do her due diligence to make sure they were actually telling the truth. She's not calling the survivors liars, but she is putting a lot of doubt into how the process of gathering their narratives even went down, which does serve to undermine them. She also seems to be implying that gathering the narratives with a goal in mind, in this case showing that Franklin's narrative is not the complete truth, is suspect somehow. Because we all know that good journalism never has a goal in mind. Nobody tell Ronan Farrow. In the article I mentioned earlier, Kali says,
demonizing Louisa and turning the women who testified into pawns distracts the reader from the testimonies and the women who wrote them, casts doubt on their authority and validity, and robs them of their main purpose, which is to point out that Franklin, self-proclaimed nice guy and polyamory guru, is a hypocrite who harms women, benefits from their pains, and colonizes their histories. Chef's narrative of distraction can only work to Franklin's benefit, which is why he frequently deploys the strategy himself.
There are no other posts on Dr. Eli's website regarding the 8 other testimonies that we have, nor has she offered any kind of update to this one. She also has never done any kind of analysis of a similar kind to Franklin's narrative. I wonder why. This talking point, Louisa being suspect for reasons, is one that to this day Franklin will not drop. As recently as his 2021 wrap-up blog post, he made the claim that Louisa was paid to gather all of the narratives, that she's not a real journalist, despite the fact that she has multiple articles available to read on her website, and that she also harassed anybody with even a lightly femme-presenting name in the comment section of previous blogs, and then emailed those people looking to trash him. He also just so happens to have never provided a single screenshot, that I've seen anyway, of any of these so-called harassing emails. I wonder why that is. I know virtually nothing about journalism, and even I know that sometimes when you are looking for leads on a story, you might end up messaging a bunch of people that end up being dead ends. Like, this isn't the smoking gun you think it is, Franklin. Also, I really want to know if she actually used the word trash in any of her emails, because according to Franklin's own logic, if she didn't actually use the word trash, it doesn't count. Anecdotally, I can tell you that what I saw within my own communities was definitely a bit mixed as well. Some people did react, and quite loudly, and I definitely saw people supporting the survivors. But there was definitely some people who I noticed became mysteriously silent, including those who usually have an opinion about everything. I also noticed that some of the people that I followed, including some really big obvious polyam names, weren't talking about this at all. And that's what got me to start asking questions. Why aren't more polyamorous leaders and organizers and people that I follow talking about this situation? Why are some people just so dead set on not believing that one of our own, a trusted polyam elder who helped to create the very community we have today, could be a toxic and even abusive individual? Turns out, finding the answer to this is far from simple. We have to really examine the way that fringe and marginalized communities view themselves and anyone they perceive as a threat, even when coming from within the community itself. We have to do a deep dive into historic oppressions, harmful stereotypes, and a few very interesting books I read on the subject.
Part 6. Black Protectionism.
In her book, Protecting Our Own, Race, Crime, and African Americans, Catherine Russell Brown explores an interesting concept called Black Protectionism. Now, I would like to acknowledge up front here that there are some very obvious reasons why this doesn't offer a one-to-one comparison to things I've seen in the polyamorous community, and I will discuss that some more later. I just wanted to ease any potential concerns before we get into this section. Am I scream anxious white ally any more than that? This type of protectionism, which is not to be confused with the foreign policy, by the way, that's a whole separate thing, describes the way that Black communities can sometimes remain defensive and skeptical when Black individuals are accused of wrongdoing. This can even happen when there is ample evidence to back up the claims, and is often bestowed upon wealthy and prominent Black men.
African American success stories are closely watched and guarded. Those who have managed to obtain large-scale prosperity in spite of legal, political, economic, educational, and social barriers are given the status of racial pioneers. It is therefore predictable that blacks as a group are suspicious when criminal charges are brought against members of its elite protected class.
There are many black male celebrities who have been afforded this kind of protectionism. Bill Cosby and R. Kelly are discussed regularly in the book, and the term itself was coined by Russell Brown in the wake of the O.J. Simpson trial. At its center, there's a very understandable and even kind of noble logic to this. After all, there is a long, sad history of black men being accused of sexual assault and other crimes without hardly any evidence, and often they face much harsher punishments than their white counterparts. The shared history of black people is one that binds them together. Slavery, Jim Crow, redlining, police brutality, the list goes on and on.
Its shared history and space have helped to create a race-based community, one with its own identity. To some degree, individual identities are muted, and the group may be seen and increasingly view itself as part of a collective. Thus, an attack on one member of the group, especially a successful high-profile member, may be thought of as an attack on the entire group.
That shared community identity and being caught up with the success of a high-profile member is definitely something I've seen in the polyamorous community. Willow Smith tweets anything remotely about non-monogamy and we all cheer. We have no choice but to stan, as I believe is what the kids say these days. And certainly Franklin is seen as a polyamorous celebrity, perhaps one of the few that we actually have. Think about the beginning of this video, the reception to More Than Two. Some of that was, no doubt in my mind, due to the fact that Franklin himself represents a successful long-term polyamorous, proof that our way of maintaining and creating relationships can be successful. In the book, there was a particular passage that stood out to me.
One way of thinking about black protectionism is to see it as the black community's response to being labeled deviant. In other words, the black community reaction to being labeled a social problem has been to dismiss the very labeling as a social problem.
Polyamory, while more widespread and better known, is still seen as strange, even deviant by some. Figures like Franklin act as a kind of aspirational porn. Some people will do anything to protect that, even with a kind of pride. Which is understandable, but it's still a huge problem when we're talking about a kind of blind allegiance that focuses far too much on the perpetrator, the person who did the alleged harm, as opposed to their victims, the ones who had the harm done to them. Now, as I said at the top, there are some ways in which comparisons to black protectionism in this case do not hold up. For one thing, Franklin and his corner of the polyamorous world appear to be mostly white, although I will be honest that I do not know the ethnicity of every single one of his partners, past and current. I do know that all of the survivors and people standing with them are white though. The shared history of polyamorous people is very different from the shared history of black people. There was never a time in history in which polyamorous people were enslaved or had laws in place that prohibit us from going to certain kinds of schools. This isn't to say that polyamorous people have never faced discrimination or any sort of unfair advantages in comparison to our monogamous counterparts. But to compare that to the history of black people, yeah, that doesn't really sit right with me. Also, black protectionism is often implemented when white people have been perceived to come for black individuals. The equivalent, monogamous people coming from someone polyamorous, isn't happening here. While some of the survivors have said that they don't consider themselves to be polyamorous anymore or ever really did, I think enough are that you really just can't in good faith argue that. I mean, not that I won't stop some people. It seems to me that it would make a lot more sense to look at this through the lens of a different type of protectionism. One centered on a community that has faced a lot of unfair discrimination and whose bedroom antics have occasionally earned them quite a bit of scorn, and is also one that I have a lot more experience in.
Part 7. Queer Protectionism.
In the Dream House is a memoir written by Carmen Maria Machado that was published in 2019. It chronicles her experiences being in an abusive relationship with another woman. Related to our discussion, Machado makes a point to discuss the way that queer communities are sometimes reluctant to recognize abuse within its midst. The problem is twofold. Firstly, growing up in straight society, our idea of what even counts as real abuse is rather heteronormative and almost cartoonish. An isolated, battered woman's at the mercy of a liquored-up brute of a man in a sweat-stained tank top, which is why it's sometimes easy to dismiss queer abuse, especially between women.
Male relationships are just complicated.
It would have probably been so much worse if she was a dude. You're lucky, really.
Bro, you know how lesbians are. So dramatic.
The other issue here is that there is already a ton of misunderstanding and harmful stereotypes around queer people's behaviors. Some truly believe that queer people are more likely to be predatory due to their very queerness. Look at the historic hand-wringing around letting gay people be teachers or Boy Scouts, or letting trans people exist literally anywhere. Some people feel a sort of shame around the idea of potentially proving the straights right. The reactions to abuse allegations in the queer community can sometimes be more akin to cringe than actual surprise or moral outrage. Machado captures it well in a section called Dream House as Sniffs from the Ink of Women.
I am unaccountably haunted by the spectre of the lunatic lesbian. I did not want my lover to be dogged by mental illness, or a personality disorder, or rage issues. I did not want her to act with unflagging irrationality. I didn't want her to be jealous or cruel. Years later, if I could say anything to her, I'd say, "For fuck's sake, stop making us look bad."
I recognize this feeling immediately because I have felt it. I'm feeling it right now. Bringing this much attention to Franklin Vo and abuse in the polyamorous community makes me really uncomfortable. I'm nervous about confirming some bigoted asshole's opinion. I feel like I need to add more caveats to this video to remind my very smart audience that definitely already knows this, that polyamorous people are not by our very nature more likely to be predatory or generally toxic just because we're polyamorous. But, anecdotally, and still being honest, I have known predatory polycules that I wouldn't get 100 miles of if I could help it. And abusive trans women. And toxic queer people. And knowing how to handle those situations sometimes is really hard. Because you want to address it and make sure people are safe and getting the help they need. But there is this fear that the second I point to a trans woman who was actually predatory one time, that some fucking BBC journalist will write a completely inaccurate article talking about how trans people are inherently predatory and here's the proof. Or some politician will make some legislation that will lead directly to discrimination and trans people's deaths. I 100% acknowledge that I have not always known how to handle allegations like this when they've been presented to me, and have likely fucked up in the past. The fear that admitting a polyamorous could be one of the bad ones, the one that proves the haters right, is a valid one. It doesn't come out of nowhere. I have heard the dismissive tone in other people's voices when a polyamorous has told them about issues that they are having. It gets real discouraging real fast.
Well, what did you expect? You're polyamorous.
Are you sure being polyamorous makes you happy?
Maybe you wouldn't have this problem if you were just monogamous again.
And these are just reactions to normal relationship issues, not even toxic behaviors or abuse. Seeing all that, it can be very tempting to try and jump to a familiar defense.
Franklin Vo isn't a real polyamorist.
There's a couple of problems with this response though. For one thing, this acts as a kind of moral gatekeeping, a way of reassuring oneself that the stink of those not as properly civilized as they can't touch them. The bad ones are kept at a distance, offered up as a sacrifice so that the rest of the community can, hopefully, be held in higher regard. For another, it makes actually addressing the issues within our own community much more difficult. Because if we deny these individuals their identity of being polyamorous, then aren't we saying that all of these troubling behaviors and disturbing patterns that we're seeing aren't really our problems to solve? I see this distancing in other marginalized and fringe communities too. Look how quickly some people are to dead name Caitlyn Jenner. Now I have a lot of issues with Caitlyn Jenner, but the proper pronouns when discussing her are still she, her, even when she's throwing other trans people under the bus. There's a section in the Dream House where Machado is talking about queer-coded Disney villains.
We deserve to have our wrongdoing represented as much as our heroism. Because when we refuse wrongdoing as a possibility for a group of people, we refuse their humanity. That is to say, queers, real-life ones, do not deserve representation, protection, and rights because they are morally pure or upright as a people. They deserve those things because they are human beings, and that is enough.
People can be shitty. That's just the reality of the world we live in. Right now, there are Black, trans, queer, and polyamorous people who have and are hurting people. They shouldn't be used as reinforcement of stale stereotypes. the further systematic opposition and oppression of the other. But on the other side, the good ones shouldn't be put up on a pedestal to be held up as some kind of impossible standard to live up to. The other isn't a saint or a monster, it's a person. They're a person. There is a lot of the debate in the polyam world about whether or not being polyamorous in itself is a queer identity. It's messy and complicated, and it's not something I really have the time to jump into now. Might be making a video about that in the future. But what I will say is that if you do see being polyamorous as queer, then the comparisons I made here hold more weight. And if you don't, well, then I hope you can at least see some of the interesting similarities between the two communities. There's another thing that we need to examine in order to understand the polyamorous community's reactions to the Franklin Vo allegations. To sum it up, the polyamorous community is really small, yo.
Part 8. 7 Degrees of Polyamory.
The polyamorous community is small, like really small. Like if you think queer relationships can get dramatic and a bit incestuous, just wait till you hear about being queer and poly, in Maine no less. Yep. For some people, this is a deeply personal situation. They may have partners in common with Franklin, or else have dated him in the past and felt their own relationship was fine. They may be friends with him, have spoken to him in the past, seen him at a conference. Speaking out against him publicly brings on the very real risk of losing access to valuable contacts, networks, and polycules that provide support and information. If you want to understand just how easy it is to throw a rock and hit someone associated with Franklin in the polyam world, I actually once quoted one of his partners. Yeah, in my unicorn hunting video, the blog I referenced that talked about where the term unicorn hunter came from, that blog is written by Jorith Innkeeper, Franklin's wife. Look at Dr. Eli's involvement in this whole mess. She has undoubtedly been extremely beneficial for the polyamorous community. The research that she has done has helped to show that our way of living is a healthy, happy choice and is not negative for children in those households. I may end up in the future quoting some of her research. That's how important she is. But she has also helped to enable and embolden Franklin, helping people in his corner to question and sow doubt into the validity of the 11 accounts we now have. Do I want her ousted from the community? No, of course not. But am I hurt and disappointed by what she has done? Yes. And until she publicly and very loudly accounts for her part in all of this, I will continue to be disappointed at her. That's just how I feel. So yeah, this is a really complicated, tangled web of issues. We simply can't just corner off everyone associated with Franklin or has a bad take about him and then just oust them out of the community once and for all. We can't just purge the bad polys. It's just too intricately woven to do so. And while I obviously lean towards publicly and very vocally showing support for the survivors, a part of me understands and even empathizes with why some people have chosen to remain silent. To a point, anyway. I also want to admit that I feel a sort of hesitance around accidentally isolating Franklin's polycule because it's not out of the realm of possibility that some of those people right now are experiencing toxic and abusive behaviors from Franklin. Pushing them out completely could make it much more difficult for them to reach out for help later on. In the book, Why Does He Do That?, Lundy Bancroft actually makes a point to address when the partners of abusers treat the victim poorly, encouraging us as readers as well as the harmed individuals to empathize with where they're coming from. It's written from the viewpoint of a monogamous relationship, but it's still pretty relevant to what we're talking about.
By the time the abuser's selfish and abusive side finally gets so bad that his new girlfriend can't rationalize it away anymore, she's in pretty deep. She may even have married him by that time. For her to accept that he's an abuser, she would have to face the terrible wrong she did to you. And that can be quite a bitter pill to swallow. So what tends to happen instead is that his new partner becomes angrier and angrier at you for the way she is being treated by him, believing you made him this way by hurting him so badly.
It's possible to be a victim of abuse and also be complicit in it. It's not a strict binary. We don't believe in strict binaries on this channel. I started off this video talking about More Than Two's reception because that aspect of the story does add a bit of a wrinkle to things. Good friends of mine who have very vocally shown support for the survivors have admitted that that book really meant a lot to them and that they still are sort of struggling to reconcile that. New polyamorous are recommended more than 2 all the time when they're first starting out. Eve Rickard herself has said that she doesn't really know how to feel about the book now.
More Than Two came out of love. It was written by 2 people who at the time loved each other deeply in the ways that each of them knew how and wanted to help other people. At least I did, and I actually do believe that Franklin did too. And yet, what came out of that love has caused harm. And yet, it's also helped people. I know it has. I believe it has. People have told me so. I hope it's helped more people than it's harmed. I don't think it's a bad book, but it was bad for me. So I really, really don't know what to tell you.
Some people watching this might be wondering if buying More Than Two is a good idea, or if it accidentally shows support to a now outed, alleged abuser. If you buy More Than Two directly from the website, then Franklin actually does get some money directly from that referral link. If you buy it anywhere else, say a local bookstore or through Thorntree Press itself, then the royalties are split 50-50, half going to Eve and the other to Franklin, with the remainder going to Thorntree Press itself. Also, be aware that morethan2.com is Franklin's personal website. It does not share any content or is not officially associated with the book in any way. I really want us all to just take a moment and pause to remember that at no point did the survivors ask for Franklin or anyone in his group to be ousted out of the community. They never wanted them to be set adrift without a paddle. There was also never a push for a boycott of More Than Two, and any statements that categorize that otherwise are, what's that little phrase I learned recently? Oh yes, demonstrably untrue. They have asked for a boycott of the morethan2.com website, which, as I mentioned earlier, is Franklin's personal website, not associated with the book at all. I recognize that could be a little confusing, but I know I have a smart audience. You all can keep up. I hope we can all agree that there is no reason to continue recommending or circulating the Game Changer in our community. Fucking none. I see absolutely no benefit to that, even if you do view it, as I do, as a work of fiction. I guess, though, we do need to talk a bit more about Franklin's version of events. Make sure you got your waders on, everybody. We're about to go through some shit.
Part 9. Accountability.
Before continuing on, I'm going to pull a basic YouTuber move here for a second and define the word accountability for you. Accountability describes the process of recognizing the harm that you have done and trying to own and make up for that behavior. It's about recognizing past mistakes and trying to do better in the future. Now let's talk about why Franklin Vaux's accountability website is the perfect example of how to do the opposite of that. In June of 2020, Franklin Vaux created the website Accountability and Polyamory. It's really another one of his blogs and actually features the Breaking My Silence post we discussed earlier. The website starts off with an accountability statement that was posted on June 18th, 2020. This is actually the 3rd version of this statement, by the way. The previous 2 iterations are saved on the Survivor Pod community resource spreadsheet, which you can find a link to in my resource document. Hell, by the time this video comes out, it may have changed yet again. This is the version we're going to focus on, though.
This site was created by Franklin Vaux to address allegations of wrongdoing against me from several sources, to provide an avenue of redress for those I have wronged, and to open a larger conversation about accountability in the poly community. If you're here, you're probably aware that several people, including Eve Rickard among others, have made serious allegations of misconduct about my past behavior. I have always strived to advocate for the highest standards of ethics in personal romantic relationships. I regret I have not always lived up to my own ideals. I have heard from people who say I have harmed them. This site is a place where I can share transparency as I seek to be accountable for the harm I have caused. Many people have raised questions about the fact I've made few public statements about the allegations or my efforts to address the harm I have caused. I have not spoken publicly about the allegations for the past 2 years because my lawyer has advised me not to. Why do I have a lawyer? There is more happening here than the general public knows about. I am engaged in an ongoing legal dispute with my former partner and co-author, Eve Rickard, over the ownership of the 2 companies we co-founded together, Tacit Pleasures and Thorntree Press, and the contracts regarding some of the books we co-authored together. Eve's public accusations began after I refused to give her my shares in our publishing company without payment. I will be talking more about this in the months ahead. The fact that I have not spoken publicly does not mean I am ignoring the accusations, nor trying to evade responsibility for the harm I have caused. Since these accusations became public, I have taken many steps to attempt to understand the harm I have caused and seek ways to address that harm and to learn from the experiences and stories of my former partners who have made statements about the harm they have experienced from me. Some of the things I've done in the wake of these stories include: 1. I have been seeing a therapist with skill and experience in non-traditional relationships. This therapy has 2 goals: to help me better understand the experiences of the people close to me so that I can become a better, more understanding, and more compassionate partner. That's one thing. That's one goal. 2. I have assembled an accountability pod made up of people with experience in the polyamory and BDSM scenes to help hold me accountable for the harm I have caused. 3. I have established a way for people who I have harmed to contact my pod, anonymously if they like, to address that harm. As I work with my partners and my therapist, I have come to realize specific behaviors and actions on my part that are harmful to the people close to me. I will talk more about the specifics in the months ahead. I am committed to a transparent process of accountability and redress of the harm I have caused, which is why I built this site. I invite anyone who has experienced harm from me to reach out, if they so desire, to my pod. I am willing to work with whatever process those who I've harmed feel comfortable with to address the causes of my harm, the behaviors that led to that harm, and whatever I can do moving forward to redressing that harm. That said, I categorically will not participate in any process that involves Eve Rickert. I have been physically, verbally, emotionally, and financially abused by Eve Rickert. In the months ahead, I will be talking about my experiences as a survivor of intimate partner domestic violence from Eve Rickert. I do not feel safe in any process that involves Eve Rickert, and I will not engage with her in any way except through my attorney. If Eve Rickert is genuinely invested in the experiences of the other women who have reported being mistreated by me, I invite her to step back to make space for them to engage in a constructive process of addressing those harms, if that is what they wish to do. It is my hope that I can separate the process of restorative justice from the pending legal and other issues that remain between Eve and me. Oh my fucking god, Mandy. He is such a piece of shit.
This whole website, which I have personally dubbed Breaking My Silence 2 Electric Boogaloo, is yet another attempt to change the narrative. This time, Franklin does so by claiming that he recognizes the harm he has done, but then simultaneously makes several claims that undermines the serious allegations and supporting testimony that we now have. So, literally the same thing he's been doing this whole time, but with a shitty new twist. Gotta keep it fresh. The accountability statement starts off with Franklin admitting that there are people who believe he has done harm to, and that he would like to work on addressing and correcting that behavior. But as the statement goes on, he hints at there being more that the public doesn't know about. He says the allegations came out after starting a legal battle with Eve, highly implying, without outright saying, that the allegations are retaliatory. Pulling a Jordan Peterson. He acknowledges working with a therapist, but as Bancroft notes in Why Does He Do That?, therapizing abusers rarely actually gets them to stop the behavior. For one thing, it's very easy to lie and manipulate to a therapist who is not specifically trained in abuser tactics. And for another, it sometimes makes the abuser equipped with language that then helps them to abuse others in the future. Franklin also makes a point to say that he will not be involved in any sort of process that involves Eve, immediately creating a set of acceptable parameters that ultimately centers the feelings of him, the alleged perpetrator, and not those of the survivors. By creating this boundary, Franklin is forcing the rest of the survivors to either throw Eve under the bus and get what measure of accountability he deems worthy, or else continue standing by her and get nothing. It also demonstrates a lack of understanding of the restorative justice process, which is set up in such a way that the alleged abuser and those that they have harmed never have to directly interact. By the way, despite the statement saying he wants to transparently address these harmful behaviors he's been accused of, he mostly doesn't really do that. I've read through this website multiple times, and for the most part, he either just ignores the allegations or he says they're not true. For example, in the April 12, 2021 post called Opening Up, Franklin says,
"In this weird up is down narrative, there are supposedly 11 of my exes who have come forward with stories of how I've abused them. The head-bending thing about this is, I don't have 11 exes. There are survivor stories from people I've never been in a relationship with, never had sex with, never had any sexual or romantic contact with. How do you respond to something like that?
Look at all those quote marks. So this is a complete misrepresentation. Had Franklin actually bothered to read all of the stories, then he would have seen that there were some people who stood with the survivors who definitely at no point considered him to be a partner. People like Marissa, Rose, and those pet lesbians he tweeted about. Also, if Franklin doesn't believe the testimonies of the 11 people who have come forward, what is he accounting for on this website exactly? We're gonna get to that. In that same post, Franklin makes the claim that Amber lied about him having gotten her into BDSM, something Amber never said. He goes on to talk about having found a box of her toys and gear.
Recently, I found some of her old boxes. One of them was filled with old DVDs belonging to her and some of her bondage gear. I sat down right there on the floor in the basement, clutching a spreader bar that had been part of her collection, and I cried. I shook and I cried, and all the time I remember thinking, this is real. I'm not delusional. She really is gaslighting me.
What Amber said in her testimony is that she felt she never fully consented to BDSM with Franklin, due specifically to her younger age and lack of experience. Not that she never owned a spreader bar. And she certainly never said that Franklin got her into kink. He's just disproving things that nobody said. The closest we get to accountability on the whole damn website is when Franklin admits to doing something that he said Eve told him to do. If you hit starting the accountability process on the website's table of contents, you will be directed to this October 21st, 2020 entry called The Hardest Thing I've Ever Written. About halfway through the post, there's a section called The Worst Thing I've Ever Done. Ooh, a pattern emerges. According to Franklin, when he and Eve were still together, a former partner of Eve's came out with a guest blog post on someone else's website that made allegations of abuse against Eve. Franklin says that as soon as that post came out, that Eve went immediately into defense mode. He describes a list of ideas that he, Eve, and a couple other people brainstormed to deal with the situation.
Asking the owner of the blog to take the survivor story down, reaching out to other poly organizers to tell them to exclude Eve's ex from their groups, finding people, ex-lovers, former friends, people like that, willing to say bad things about Eve's ex in order to discredit her story, massaging and reshaping events in Eve's ex's past to try to create a narrative that painted Eve's ex as an abuser, reaching out to people who host online forums about polyamory to tell them not to carry anything written by Eve's ex.
He goes on to say that the host of this website removed the post shortly before signing a publishing deal, implying in the process that it was actually a condition of them being signed.
I wasn't involved in and didn't know anything about the state of the negotiations while this was happening. But if the decision had been mine, I would have chosen to sign him in an instant. He was in an impossible situation. If you're in negotiations to sign your first publishing contract, and the person who will make the final decision about your future tells you to remove an abuse report about her, you do it. Nor am I saying it was a direct quid pro quo. Only that if you're in negotiations with a publisher, and the person you're negotiating with asks for something, you'll naturally tend to take that request in the best possible light.
Does anyone else notice how much the story isn't about Franklin? In my opinion, this story is not about Franklin owning up to any harm he did, but actually is about establishing a pattern of Eve having a history of abuse and silencing past victims. The end goal is not about owning up to past wrongs, but is in fact about discrediting Eve and anybody who stands with her. He is trying to make the claims of a conspiracy against him seem more legitimate by providing a previous example. It's deflection. It's a distraction tactic. Now, it turns out the mysterious unnamed blog owner from the story is none other than Kevin Patterson from Poly Role Models. You may remember 20 years ago at the start of this video, I mentioned Kevin in his book Love is Not Colorblind. He was actually published through Thorntree Press, the publishing house started by Franklin and Eve. So Franklin seems to be implying here that the book would not have been published if Kevin hadn't silenced this victim of abuse. How do I know it's Kevin? Well, Kevin actually filmed and posted a response to these allegations, and I'm just gonna let Kevin speak for himself.
So, if you are unaware, my blog used to feature these anonymously written horror stories where the writer would also explain what they learned from the experience because it's a teaching tool. So he says, the latest story on your blog, it's somebody who we believe to be an abuser. They recontextualized the story in a way that made them the victim instead of the abuser. It was a name that I had heard before, so I was like, all right, bet. Like, it was a name that I had heard some shady shit about before. Somebody I knew asked me to remove a story where there was some shady shit. Somebody apparently was using my blog for some shady shit. And like, first things first, if what they're saying is true, then whoever is at the other end of that situation is an abuse survivor. And outing abuse survivors is a really shitty thing to do. So I ain't ask, and he ain't tell. If you're in negotiations to sign your first publishing contract, and the person who will make the final decision about your future tells you to remove an abuse report about her, you do it. No, the fuck you don't. I don't know how your ethics work, but I know mine doesn't remove some abuse report because of some contract. What the fuck? And also, my publishing contract had been signed. My contract had been signed a year before I removed that story. By the time I removed that story, we were working on cover art. We were all on the second round of editing. We had a release date. It would be less than 5 months before I held the finished product in my hands. She held all the power, including the power to shape his future. What kind of white savior by proxy bullshit is that? Ancient Negro proverb. Keep my name out your mouth.
Oh, Kevin? You dropped this. In the comment section of the Facebook post where Kevin actually posted this, there is actually a copy of the contract that he signed. And it was indeed signed a whole year prior to this event happening. And remember, Franklin was an owner of Thorntree Press when this all took place, so claiming he didn't really know the state of negotiations is a bit doubtful. We do know from Eve's account that he wasn't always the most present employee, but he can't really make the claim that he knows Kevin was being essentially strong-armed into removing a blog post, but then at the same time make the claim that he doesn't really know what was going on with the publishing contract. Like, pick one, Franklin. The person that went to go speak to Kevin about this blog post was named by Franklin in his Man Whore podcast interview, an individual named Peppermint. And Peppermint has also come forward to state that Franklin's version of these events is incorrect. You can actually read their comment on Kevin's Facebook post as well.
1. Kevin didn't know that Eve was involved when the post was taken down. 2. The post was taken down on its own merits. The person in question who had submitted it engaged in some dishonesty to get it posted, and I knew that the post itself was full of lies via a separate source. 3. Franklin was at the meeting where we discussed this and was in full agreement with the actions we took. Franklin said that the post was false. 4. According to what I have heard from other parties, Eve was not abusive towards the person who submitted the post. In short, Franklin is a big ol' liar, and you can't trust anything that comes out of his mouth.
Okay, so to recap, the other people involved in the situation, this one that Franklin is trying to own up for having once supposedly silenced a victim of Eve's abuse, have come forward to say that this version of events is not accurate. They have said that the person who wrote the blog was not a victim of abuse. They apparently were an abuser themselves. The owner of the blog didn't remove the post to please their future publishers, who were actually their current publishers, and actually removed the post because they were concerned the blog post wasn't accurate. People outside of this little supposed cabal were also concerned about the honesty of this post. Hell, it's not even clear if the blog post mentioned Eve in any capacity at all. Franklin did make a follow-up blog post, by the way, and it is just some backpedaling nonsense. I'm gonna spare you, but basically what he says is that he never actually said that Kevin, was forced to remove this blog post in order to get published. Pulling a Jordan Peterson. It's really gross and unconvincing and kind of reads a little racist to me. Also reads racist to Kevin too, who made a follow-up response.
I want to say unequivocally that Kevin Patterson absolutely deserves to be published. You're goddamn right I do. That's the only part you got right. You tried to play it off like no one would notice. You tried to put a timeline on it like you knew what you were talking about. And then the second I post that I have receipts, you make this whole fucking post to walk it back. Fucking piece of shit. You lied. You lied and you were wrong, and we got receipts, and now you're trying to walk it back. Like Eve uplifted me, like Eve and Thorntree Press and this publishing contract that barely fills my gas tank is what got me up out of a bad situation. Power to shape my future. That racist ass fucking shit. In another essay, I will be exploring how about no?
We're not worthy!
Also, can we all just take a moment to acknowledge just how objectively shitty it was for Franklin to buy the domain accountabilityandpolyamory.com? Even if there is any truth to these allegations, it does not at all represent what this website is. Call it abuseandpolyamory.com. Call it Eve Rickard is a me and I'm breaking my silence for the 100th time.com. Literally anything would have been more accurate and actually represent what this website is better than this fucking troll choice he went with. There are a few more posts on this site. I'm not gonna bother going through them all. It's just mostly a bunch more counter accusations, Eve abused me, blah, blah, blah. You get it. I read them all, so you all don't have to. You're welcome. Speaking of going through some shit no one else wants to. Part 10. Franklin Vo's version of the truth appears to be wrong, allegedly. I'm about to go full H-Bomber guy, and I'm okay with that. Horses don't exist. It would be mean of me to claim that everything that Franklin Vo says is fabricated or made up. It would perhaps indeed be a bit unfair to call him a liar, liar, pants on fire. So I am not going to do that. You heard it here. I will not accuse Franklin Vo of lying. But what I am going to say is there seems to be a few things that he is either misremembering or being misleading about. His version of the truth seems to be at odds with the rest of reality. The words that come out of his mouth are quite often provably incorrect. Let's go through a few of these falsehoods, shall we?
That same ex wanted me to use street drugs with her. She was a self-described heavy user of recreational drugs. When I said no, I'd literally never used recreational drugs before. She spent more than 3 months continuing to pressure me. At one point, printing out a stack of paper explaining why my reasons for saying no were wrong.
A common theme in Franklin's narrative is one of passivity, of being forced to do things he didn't really want to do because of having bad boundaries. It's something that he brings up quite a bit. Franklin has described himself as being conflict averse, almost to the point of being a phobia. But what's interesting is this passivity only ever seems to come up when Franklin's motivations are in questions. Like when you ask him what he's done wrong in the past, it's sort of his go-to excuse. Which brings us to this Quora post. In it, Franklin accuses Eve of having forced him to do street drugs, which is not how most people categorize shrooms, by the way. She even supposedly presented him with a stack of paper meant to change his mind. And if I thought there was any truth to this story, I would 100% be upset about this. Kids, it's okay to not do drugs. It's also okay if you do drugs, but your friends don't. Pressuring someone into doing drugs is bad, okay? But Franklin seems to be forgetting that his old receipts are still available to the general public, and they paint a very different picture about his drug use.
I turned to psychedelic mushrooms when I was 46 because I've had an awesome life and I'm generally happy and well-adjusted. I was doing some introspection while working on a book. I thought psychedelics might help with the introspection, and I was right. My experience with psilocybin was so positive and amazing that I've continued to use psilocybin about once every 1.5 years or so since then. When I was 47, I tried hallucinogenic mushrooms for the first time. Excuse me? When I was 47, I tried hallucinogenic mushrooms for the first time. My experience with them was absolutely awesome. In fact, I would rank it among the most positive experiences I've ever had. I've used mushrooms a couple of times in the 3 years since, and will likely use them again at some point in the future. The only psychedelic I've used is psilocybin mushrooms. I've used them 3 times over the past 5 years. I had an awesome experience every time.
Before the allegations, he was a brave adventurer, a charming and perhaps older than usual explorer into the realm of recreational drug use. Now, he's a hostage, a passive victim of a drug-fueled abuser. He never once mentions any pressure or somebody else presenting the idea of him doing drugs in multiple retellings of the story prior to the demonization of Eve, which you think would have at least been hinted at. And this also paints an odd conflicting story with any of the other previous mentions of drug use. like this particular anecdote.
I've enlisted Eve to help do a controlled blind experiment involving capsules filled with Noopept and capsules filled with confectioner's sugar. Eve has offered to fill a month's worth of capsules with each and then place them in numbered but otherwise unmarked bottles. The idea is to take the contents of one bottle, chosen at random with Eve not aware of which one I've chosen, for a month, recording how I feel, then take the contents of the second bottle for a month with similar record keeping, and see if there's any subjective experience that is not consistent with the placebo effect.
So in this story, Eve is presented almost like a lab assistant, there to help Franklin with his drug experimentations. But now she's a pusher, forcing him to do drugs?
She was like, I'm a pusher, Katie. I'm a pusher.
What does that even mean?
Like a drug pusher?
This honestly rubs me the wrong way too, because Franklin's tone here just comes off so judgmental, as if there was any shame in habitual drug use. People with drug dependency deserve empathy and respect. And if Franklin is going to continue using such disparaging language, well, maybe he should take a step back and re-examine his own use of street drugs.
By the time I left, I was no longer allowed to choose what food to eat, what shoes to buy, what clothes to wear. Things that, when I look back now, I would have described as major red flags if they were happening to anyone else. I simply dismissed as little quirks.
Saying that Eve was controlling is another one of Franklin's frequent claims. Proof that it was she, not he, that is the real abuser. Indeed, controlling a partner's behavior can in fact be proof of abuse. But again, Franklin's old receipts do paint a bit of a conflicting picture here.
Eve, in her ongoing attempt to make me more self-sufficient in the nutrient procurement department, has been encouraging me to learn the dark arts of cooking and baking, by whose secret alchemy ingredients are transmogrified into food.
Franklin's insistence that Eve was exerting more and more control over him so that he would become more dependent on her is entirely undermined by the story in which Eve was teaching him to become self-sufficient. Also, it's worth remembering from some of the survivor testimonies that Franklin's inability to take care of himself, including choosing his own wardrobe or what to eat, was remarked upon.
He never had to worry about clothes, food. I did all the shopping. I did all the cooking. I did all the cleaning.
And there was this bit at the beginning of Lauren's story that I didn't even mention earlier.
He was pretty willingly helpless. I refuse to believe that someone that intelligent cannot figure out how to make macaroni and cheese.
There are also several points in the allegations where people would say that Franklin would make the claim they were being controlling just for taking the horrible stance of advocating for their needs. So I personally do not trust Franklin Vaux's definition of the word control.
I definitely don't think I'm an authority.
But you did write with a sense of authority. I mean, because I've read some of the things you've written, and they're almost. I mean, you were on a live journal giving advice to people, like answering questions. I
don't know that that's necessarily true. I call things the way I see them. Some people find the things that I say useful, and that's cool. If they find them useful, I've had people say, "Oh yeah, this thing that you said, it was amazing." I'm like, "Oh, cool."
Did you question whether or not you should still give advice?
Of course I did. And I stopped giving advice for a while.
Yeah.
At least on relationships.
Because Louis C.K. thought he went away for a while. And we were like, dude, it was like a few months.
And then, people said, hey, people started actually asking me questions again. And I'm like, well, if people find value in the things that I have to say, cool.
Again, notice the passivity of Franklin's statements here, the dodging of direct responsibility. I have never called myself an expert, but other people say I am. I would never claim to be an authority, but I do choose to answer the questions that other people bring to me. It's like he's the reluctant leader of a cult or something, like he just can't bear to not answer the clamoring masses just beating down his door. His hands are tied to a keyboard. But Franklin made the choice to write about non-monogamy. He's the one posting on Quora every day, who has willingly attended speaking gigs, and who has helped to co-write 400+ page books on non-monogamy. He can't pretend that he never presented himself as an authority just because of deliberately omitted word choices. Actions speak louder than words, and they are screaming over this whole "I'm just a guy" faux humble bullshit. Hey, faux rhymes with faux. Interesting. Part of what makes this a bit infuriating for me is that Franklin actually discusses parasocial relationships in the Man Whore podcast interview, which describes the relationship between a content creator and their audience.
There's actually a word for this. It's called parasociality. And it's a psychological term, and it means the feeling that somebody has when they read a person's writing, or they see a person in a movie, or they read a book by a person and assume that they know that person.
Yeah.
But that to that person, you're just a complete stranger.
Now, plenty of other people have talked about parasocial relationships, so I am not going to do like a whole big deep dive here. If you want to know more about the subject, watch Abigail Thorne or Internet Impacts videos, or Harker the Storyteller. I have all of those linked down below in my resources document. What I will say here is that Franklin is admitting that this kind of relationship is a little bit more of a two-way street than he's letting on. The content creator creates the content. They make very specific choices about how it's presented or what's being shown. They create it with specific goals in mind, and then they present that to their audience. Then the audience gives feedback. The content and personality is specifically curated, usually doing so to create a sense of knowing the creator within the audience member. I can speak to this because, hi, you are currently on my channel where I have created much content for you to consume. When I started this channel, I made a point to talk a little bit about who I am and why I did, and a bit about my background, most notably mentioning that I don't really consider myself an expert. I'm self-taught, though that's pretty much true of all non-monogamy experts. But it would be silly of me to pretend like I don't talk with some measure of authority, especially because now I have a bit of a following here. Do I consider myself an expert? No. But would I continue to make content if I didn't think I had the knowledge and ability to do so? Of course not. And neither would Franklin. Some people, not me, mind you, but others, might look at this in a bit of a cynical way. That maybe Franklin is trying to purposely downplay his role as an educator or authority because of the call-in letter. By downplaying his influence, it can make it seem like the call or request to no longer speak as an authority seem less legitimate. I have no authority. I'm just a guy. Asking me not to speak when spoken to is just silly. They're the ones who called me authority. Them. Take it up with them. Now, if you excuse me, I have to work on another book about non-monogamy. Franklin. Frankie. Frank. You're either an influencer who has given actual presentations on abuse, or you're a nobody who's taking up space that the real expert should be occupying. You're either an educator, according to your own account, or you're a nobody, a fraud who should be sending your audience elsewhere. Which is it? Oh, also, good luck with your sex education podcast. Yeah, he fucking started a sex education podcast. You know, something a person who definitely doesn't see themselves as an expert would do.
I have not tried to do any poly conferences. I have not attended any poly conferences.
Have they been hitting you up? No
actually,
offense.
You
but
would be surprised.
I would be surprised. Okay. Would you name one off mic if I just wanted to check and just to fact check?
No.
One thing that I find makes Franklin's claims less reputable than those of the survivors is the lack of counter evidence. Anytime something would easily exonerate Franklin or prove his point, it just is conveniently missing. Like a letter Eve supposedly sent filled with harassing, horrible things was burnt. There are no screenshots of these emails Louisa supposedly sent out. Meanwhile, the survivors and those standing with them have receipts. Many of them, in fact. Here, Franklin has the opportunity for some solid fact-checking to be done in his favor, but he refuses. Why? If Franklin was concerned about the privacy of the con in question being protected, then I'm sure all he had to do was just ask Billy to keep it off the record, which Billy actually does offer to do in this section. But Franklin refuses, and thus we have only his word to go on. I wonder if a YouTuber who got maybe a little too deep into this rabbit hole decided to email a few prominent polyamorous conferences if any of them would be willing to confirm or deny this claim off the record. But that would be silly, right? I mean, there's far more meaningful things I could spend my time on other than this.
Good evening.
My name is Maylee Mandy, a YouTuber and content creator who primarily makes videos about non-monogamy. I'm currently doing some fact-checking for a future video and was hoping you may be able to provide some assistance. I came upon an interview on a podcast in which the interviewee, Franklin Vo, co-author of More Than Two, who has recently been accused of toxic and abusive behaviors, makes the claim that he has been invited to speak at conferences and conventions. During this interview, Franklin refused to offer an even off-the-record name so that this could be fact-checked and verified. For the purposes of my research, I'm attempting to find out if there's any claim to this statement. To that end, I'm reaching out to a few polyamorous conventions and organizations to see if they will be willing to confirm or deny having ever reaching out to Franklin after the allegations came out. I will be keeping everyone's name off the record, only saying that out of blank number of conferences I reached out to, blank many confirmed or deny this. My aim here is not to put any organization or community on blast, only to see if there is any truth to the statement that Mr. Vo himself has provided no evidence for. I appreciate your time and hope to hear from you soon. Thank you, Mainly Mandy. So I sent this same email out to 9 different polyamorous conferences, conventions, and events. And here are the results. Of the 9, 1 was apparently the wrong email and immediately got sent back to me. Okay. But out of the other 8, 5 of them have confirmed that Franklin has definitely not been asked to speak since the allegations have come out. In fact, one of them made a point to mention that they haven't really had any events to speak at anyway due to the pandemic, which was an angle of this I honestly kind of forgot when I sent out the email. I did find out after doing all this that one of Franklin's partners, Eunice Hung, is apparently one of the organizers for one of the London-based polyam events, so I guess it's possible that she has enough pull that she can get him invited. Or maybe, she's just sort of mentioned it in passing and Franklin has since twisted that into being asked officially to be in a conference. Certainly considering his track record, not out of the realm of possibility. To be fair, we do also know that there are some polyam elders who are sticking by Franklin during all this, so yeah, this one isn't completely provably false. Although I personally still have a lot of skepticism around it. You're free to make your own conclusions. Hope you enjoyed my pettiness. Actually, nah, this is undoubtedly the pettiest thing I'm including in this video essay. This part is just for me, and if nobody else cares, that's fine. Go to this time stamp to skip. On the scale of shitty things that Franklin has allegedly done, this is honestly pretty low, but I do think this acts as a kind of demonstration of how Franklin can sometimes manipulate facts to make himself look better. Plus, I just think it's really fucking funny. In several Quora posts, Franklin discusses the publisher of his new books that were written with previously mentioned partner Eunice Hung.
I just finished a conference call with my co-author Eunice and our publisher, where we talked about doing more virtual book events, among other less interesting things. Earlier this afternoon, I got a special gift from my publisher, a poster of the cover for The Brazen Altar, the first novel I co-authored with my crush, which will be out next spring. I publish my work by sending Word files to the publisher.
These books, erotic fantasies, are being published through a company called Luminestra Press, which was founded in 2019. They don't have many titles listed so far. In fact, the series done by Franklin and Eunice takes up about half of the titles listed on their website so far. Honestly, when I heard that Franklin was still publishing books, I was a little surprised. I just kind of assumed that nobody would be touching him with a 9-foot pole right now, considering the reputation he has. But hey, he's still a big name, and I don't know, maybe they just really believe in his writing. Oh, interesting. So when Franklin kept talking about the publisher buying him a gift, he was talking about one of his fellow publishers, right? Surely he wasn't referring to himself in the third person, right? Why Franklin did this, I can't say for certain, nor would I dream of speculating. Certainly he wasn't being deliberately vague about the connections, because, it's a lot more impressive to make it seem like, you've been chosen at random by a publishing company as opposed to a publishing company that you own. And I certainly can't imagine that he did this because he wants to be in competition with the publishing company that he owned previously with someone who is now alleging multiple accounts of abuse against him. I didn't say that. Don't put words in my mouth. We discussed that. I have a publisher. I do. They're in London with my hot girlfriend who's Canadian and goes to a school that you've never even heard of, so I'm not even gonna bother telling you about it. It's so easy to look up. Why be less than truthful about this? Now, originally I was gonna chuckle at this just like a little bit longer and then end the section here, but there was a really interesting update that came out a couple of months ago while I was finishing up this script. Jonathan Kent, one of Franklin's fellow publishers, has a book coming out called A World Beyond Monogamy, which of course is being published through Luminastra Press. And it came out that some of the people who contributed to the book didn't know about the connection between Luminastra and Franklin Veaux, and have since asked for their quote to be removed. Hell, I even tweeted about this, and you can see right here the claim being made that Franklin has been asked to step down from Luminastra Press. The exact circumstances of why Franklin has been asked to step down aren't clear. Also, just because Franklin is no longer an owner, it doesn't mean that Luminastra Press won't be still profiting off of the sale of his books. Honestly, it doesn't really bother me that Franklin is writing fiction. I mean, clearly he's really good at it. Oh shit! And I can't control how people spend their money. I do think trying to be informed as possible though is important, and that people deserve to know the link between Franklin Veaux and Luminastra Press, even if it's now in the past. I, for one, have absolutely no interest in giving any money to Luminastra Press, will not be buying any of their titles in the future, and will probably continue to make a lot of noise about this. Again, this one is honestly kind of petty, but also really funny to me, and I will take any and all opportunities in this story to laugh where I can. It just has such self-made billionaire fails to acknowledge his first garage was bought by his parents' energy.
So Eve actually talked on a blog about, or on a...
I didn't listen to it, but I think Don Sarah's podcast or something like Sex Gets Real or whatever.
Yeah, talked about, I've spent $10,000 getting these stories.
Did she say exactly that?
Yeah, I believe that she said something to that effect, yes.
The subject of money is a weird focus that has shown up in this story a few times. There was that strange comment in Dr. Eli's post, the accusations being thrown at Louisa and her motivations, and also this comment made in April of 2019.
No, I mean, she went to everyone in my social circle, including all of my ex-partners she could find, told them all that I had abused her, and then, get this, paid money to have them say I abused them too.
This is a very serious allegation. And if there were any truth to this, I would also be very concerned. Luckily, there isn't. At the end of the second Man Whore podcast episode, Billy makes it clear that when fact-checking this, it was revealed to be not accurate. Franklin says that Eve is the one who revealed this $10,000 figure, but she didn't. It was Dawn Sarah over at the Sex at Dawn podcast.
No, it was called Sex Gets Real with Dawn. I'm sorry. I don't know why I kept getting it wrong in every fucking take. I don't know why I kept confusing the name of the podcast with the book, Sex at Dawn. I don't know why. I'm very sorry. Ignore me.
Episode 261.
The process, as you'll hear Samantha Manowitz say, has already cost over $10,000.
Okay, so that conversation with Samantha actually happens on the following episode, 262. And at the beginning of the episode, Dawn actually updates that figure to $20,000.
I also just want to note, there has been so much labor on the part of the Survivor Pod to gather stories, to support the survivors, to engage in dialogue with the community, to track everything that's unfolding, to craft really thoughtful and important messages and updates about the process they're engaging in. And I was wrong last week when I said that expenses have been estimated at $10,000. They're over $20,000 at this point.
What's interesting though is that during this interview with Samantha never actually says the figure. She mentions the PayPal and how it's going to be used to pay the experts and consultants that have been brought in, but the exact dollar amount isn't said by her. Just to make sure I was doing my diligence, I actually sent Dawn an email asking for some clarification on where this dollar amount came, and here is her response. Okay, she never actually got back to me. Does this shit ever happen to Cat Black? As far as I and Billy can tell, the actual amount of money raised was $1,300, which was used primarily for transcription costs. You can actually find that link in Dawn's show notes as well as in my own resources, the goal of which was set to $2,000. So it seems like maybe Dawn just accidentally added an extra zero? Regardless, Franklin didn't even hear them right in terms of what they were talking about. Nobody said we raised or paid $10,000. What was said by somebody who was not then nor has ever been a part of the Survivor Pod was that the costs were looking to be about $10,000, and so that's how much they were looking to raise. two very different statements. So yeah, this whole follow the money conspiracy theory led me to an easily fact-checked thing that Franklin either completely misremembered or else was being purposely misleading about in hopes that someone with less time and energy would look into it. That was your first mistake, Franklin. And that's where I'd like to end this section. Certainly there are plenty more not completely factual things Franklin has said, but I think you all get the point, and this section has definitely gone on far too long as it is. Plus, I threw in that publisher thing. Needless to say, if Franklin Vo claims something, I would recommend actually looking into it before accepting his version of reality. And again, if Franklin or anyone else in his corner is upset that I have portrayed him as a liar, I say unto you, I never actually called him a liar. I learned it from watching you, Franklin! Oh, and since we were just talking about Franklin's unsubstantiated financial claims, there is something I need to get ahead of now while I'm thinking about it. Part 11. I am not being paid by Eve Rickert. Or anyone for that matter. Other than my super cool patrons. Love you, folk! I honestly resent that I need to interrupt my own video to address this, much in the same way I was annoyed at having to add a caveat at the top of this thing. But because of how easy it is for Franklin and people in his corner to manipulate facts to their advantage or go looking for connections that don't exist, I feel I have to address this. I, mainly Mandy, do solemnly swear that I'm up to no good. Fuck, shit, sorry, let me try it again. I, mainly Mandy, do solemnly swear that I have not now, nor have I ever been paid to make this video by Eve Rickert or any of the other people who have come forward accusing Franklin of toxic, harmful, and in some cases, abusive behavior. As I said at the top, I have turned monetization off of this video. I don't make a lot anyway, and let's face it, this would not be very advertiser friendly. This video also is not sponsored. Nebula's playing hard to get. The only money I will make from this video is because of my supporters over on patreon.com/mainlymandy. For those of you who don't know, Patreon is kind of like a members only club where people who, enjoy what I do can give me money to support me, and in exchange I also give them access to certain, bonus content and such that is not available anywhere else. At time of recording, I make roughly $133 a month. I do occasionally make money off of one-time donations through Venmo, Coffee, or PayPal, and as much as it would be nice to get paid for all the labor I put in this video, I am not asking for anyone to do that. If anything, I would like you to donate any extra bucks you have to some kind of program that helps abuse survivors instead. I had already written 22 pages of what would eventually be a 75-page monstrosity of a script before I ever had any contact with any of the survivors. I am happy to admit that I was following Eve via a few of her social media accounts, I think Twitter and Instagram prior to this, and we had definitely interacted, maybe comments a few times. But until July of 2021, that was it. And in my correspondence with the survivors, I was never once pressured or goaded on or pushed to cover the situation in a particular way. The only significance of that correspondence was me just getting to make sure certain aspects of my timeline was correct, asking for a few clarifying details that just helped me to round out the existing testimonies that we already have publicly, and also being directed to a few sources that honestly, I probably would have found eventually. It just saved me some time. Even with all of that, some people are still gonna say that they see Eve Rickert's influence, or the other survivors for that matter, all over this video. And as annoying as that is, people are welcomed to be wrong. The idea that listening to alleged survivors of abuse makes me somehow suspect or not worthy of consideration really just doesn't sit right with me, nor am I interested in distancing myself from the survivors. That kind of disavowing just feels really gross. Why would I do that? Because pretentious Yahoo Answers might get mad? I already know that Franklin's not gonna watch this whole video. He's not. He'll watch maybe a little bit of it, but in no time he'll abandon ship and then run off to his followers to let them all know that this isn't well researched, it's biased. He'll probably accuse me of being mean-spirited, even though I actually did do my best to try and keep all of my criticisms directly related to this situation. He'll probably also misrepresent some of my talking points and then debunk ones I didn't actually say. Place your bets below. Tell me in the comments what ridiculous thing is Franklin gonna make up to debug. Let me know. was really obnoxious. By the way, I want to make it clear, I am not above criticism. I'm sure some people will give me feedback on this video that is very much coming from a good faith, like, reading of it, and I welcome and very much hope to read those comments below. However, if the criticism is based on any of the manipulation tactics and distraction shenanigans that we have seen from Franklin and his corner thus far in this situation, I will be laughing at you. There is one major way that I feel this video has a large bias outside of what my own time researching and examining the facts led me to. And that is hard to talk about. But let's do it. Let's get into it. All cards on the table. I am happy to show you all my stains. Unlike some people, I'm able to acknowledge that. I am also a survivor of abuse.
Part 12. My bit of bias.
This is my least favorite part of the script. My YouTube confessional moment. I think this is the last one I'm allowed to do for a while. I certainly don't have to. No one's forcing me to do this. Hell, my abusive relationship was back when I was still monogamous, so does it even matter now? Maybe not. But I do feel a desire to control as much as possible my part of the narrative, especially this part. It's not like I've never talked about it before. I've hinted about it on this channel a couple of times. I wrote a blog post once about it over on my website. In the past few years especially, I've become increasingly vocal about my experiences, about what my ex-fiancé did. Hell, I once even publicly named him. I won't do it here because, this YouTube feels very different than sharing on like a local social media level. My former abuser doesn't have the influence or platform that Franklin does. I mean, as far as I know anyway. My ex never hit me, but he did leave his mark on me. I wasn't allowed to be upset with him. He would sometimes compare me to other people's girlfriends and ask me why I couldn't be like them, or he would mock me in private. Getting him to participate in any kind of cleaning or chores was an uphill battle. He needed constant emotional labor, but to ask it in return, well, he had depression, so pushing my needs on him too much was essentially risking pushing the chair out from underneath him. He never said it point blank, but trust me, it was understood. Threats of suicide were his primary means of controlling me and his response to any behavior that I tried pushing back on. I learned to live a hollow shell of my life, one where all of my needs were secondary because I didn't want the person that I loved to die. I mean, who does? There are so many stories I can tell you. I mean, what do you want to know? You want to know why I hate having my feet touched so much? That's basically a phobia now. To be fair, I always hated that, even when I was a little girl. But when I was with my ex-fiance, he would do this thing sometimes where he would pin me down and touch them without permission, even when I begged him to stop. And if in trying to get free, and wiggling and everything, I ended up hurting him. Like one time I remember I accidentally kicked him in the balls. Oh boy, it was like I had become the abuser. There are all these little quirks I have, little behaviors. Like I can suddenly become really self-conscious that I'm taking up too much space, and anywhere, with friends, loved ones, group chats, you name it. I've realized that one of the reasons why I hate crying in front of people is it feels unsafe because of the way he would react to me sometimes. One of the reasons why it took me so long to seek help for my own mental health stuff is because I was scared to admit that something was wrong because I was scared that having a mental illness meant that I would abuse someone like he abused me. Fuck. Remember the crying thing I just fucking said? There was this one time, and I laugh now because in retrospect it is funny. I'm giving everyone permission to laugh at this. But this one time I was riding the bus home from work, and this person got on the bus, and it was the splitting image of my ex-fiance. Like, even down to the clothes they were wearing. It was uncanny. And as soon as I saw this person, I just, the blood just started coursing through my body. There was this heat in my chest, and my fist started clenching. I have never been so ready to get into a fight in my entire life. If there had been a bottle next to me on the bus, I would have broken over the side of my seat, I swear. It turned out it wasn't him. It was somebody else, you know, just some poor commuter who just earned completely unearned death glares for me for the rest of the ride home. Poor dude probably just like had his car in the shop or something, and I'm just in the back of the bus just like, I'm sorry for my trauma response to your face. The worst thing for me is the nightmares. They're always the same. I run into my ex somewhere, and he wants to get back together. I confront him with all of the behaviors, you know, everything he did to me. And he doesn't remember any of it, claims that I must be thinking of someone else, that we were great together, we should get back together, blah, blah, blah. And we run into my friends, and all of my friends tell me we should get back together too, and none of them believe me. So we do. And there's always this feeling in those dreams. It's like I'm trapped, you know? Like I'm as pinned down as every time when he would touch my feet without permission. And, you know, even now, years later, when I wake up from those dreams, I'll just be terrified that he'll be in the room with me. I don't have those dreams as often as I used to, thankfully. But I did have it again a few weeks before I filmed this. I know objectively how silly this all might seem to some people. You know, it's fucking feet, for God's sakes. But even now, I find myself, you know, preemptively telling people, do not touch my feet. Don't even look at them if you can help it. Like, I know it's just a nail to you, but I just can't stand that kind of hammering ever again. I can't. If I'm being honest with all of you and with myself, I think part of why I feel the need to talk much more openly about it now is that it took me so long to do so. And in that time, my abuser certainly hasn't stopped. And every time another one of his exes reaches out to me, I wonder if it's my fault. Maybe in part, I wanted to make this video to help make up for the harm that happened because of my own silence. So yes, I am a victim myself, a survivor. I can't pretend that I just made this video because I'm trying to be a good ally or because I think it's important to talk about this kind of situation. I mean, it is that too, that's part of it, but it's more than that. What's happening with Franklin Vo in the polyamory community is not new. It has happened before, and it will happen again, guaranteed. There are people right now who have been in abusive polyamorous relationships or in one now who are being actively dismissed, if not outright silenced. And to be honest with all of you, I'm really fucking tired of it. I'm tired that fringe communities like the queer community or the polyam community or the places where they intersect just so often do not deal with the toxic and harmful elements within their midst. One of the books I read for this video was a book about queer abuse from the 80s. The 80s! And we still haven't fucking learned anything. And I'm also tired for the guilt that I feel. For the times when maybe I wasn't the perfect victim. For when I did say things that in retrospect were pretty awful, but came from a place of hurt. Maybe that's another reason I made this video, to make up for the guilt from The last conversation that I had with my former abuser was the day after we broke up. I found out that he was cheating on me, which is what I finally needed to bring up the courage to break up with him. And I kicked him out of the apartment that was in my name. The next day, he reached out to me over Facebook Messenger asking for some paperwork that he had left behind. And I did agree to let a mutual friend of ours come and get it. As soon as I had agreed to that, he was right back to his old tricks. Started talking this very, woe is me way. Never fucking apologized. Didn't ask me how I was doing. Just immediately started talking about himself. And at one point, he said the thing that up till then had always worked on me. I'm thinking about killing myself. And I told him to fucking do it already. That part of that story would be so easy to twist, to take out of context, to turn it into some new narrative where I'm either the real abuser or at the very least a mutual one. Because without the rest of that story, that sounds understandably atrocious. It's certainly not something I would say now. But I wasn't actually telling my ex-fiance to kill himself. I was telling my abuser in no uncertain terms, that doesn't work on me anymore. For the first time in 3 years, I prioritized my survival over his. And it felt really fucking good. It did. And I don't think I'm gonna feel guilty about that anymore. Or at least I'm gonna try really hard not to. And look, I'm not saying everyone watching this has to be okay with it. It is totally understandable if you don't like it. It's certainly not something I would say now. But to look at that one thing and say that that must prove that my allegations against my ex somehow aren't real because I didn't fit your idea of what a meek and true victim of abuse would look like.
That is one big pile of shit.
By the way, mutual abuse, the idea that two people were so terrible for each other that they both managed to somehow abuse each other, is just such a false narrative, and it's one that we all need to do a lot better about pushing back on. Victims in these situations often are made to feel like the real monsters, and having the public pile on to that just does not help at all. Rachel Oates actually has a really fantastic video going through the allegations between Johnny Depp and Amber Heard. It's a really fantastic video, and she actually breaks down a bit why this idea of mutual abuse is ultimately just bullshit. She also opens up about her own history of having once been abused as well. That video will be available in my resources down below. I highly recommend you give it a watch. Assuming I stick to my deadline, this video will be coming out on February 25th, 2022. That date is really special to me for a couple of reasons. For one thing, it will be a little over a year since I started this channel, which I'm really glad to have stuck with it and to have you all here with me. Thank you so much for the past year. It also will be 10 years to the day that I left my abuser for good. Full decade. That's it's wild to think about. There's so many experiences I've had that I probably wouldn't have had if I'd stayed with him. Or friends and lovers I've met along the way. I mean, don't get me wrong, it hasn't been all, sunflowers and rainbows and unicorns and, hashtag girl boss reclaiming myself, but even all the bad stuff that's happened to me in the last decade, I'm really glad it did because, that stuff meant that I lived, that I'm still living. I'm really glad I'm still here. Make no mistake. Going through someone's story of abuse and having to show the many ways that it may be flawed does not fill me with joy. I've added some levity here and there, mostly just to make this video a little more palatable and also because honestly my own mental health, this is just how I deal with shit sometimes. But I don't relish it. And any statements that seem to suggest otherwise made by Franklin or anybody else are lies. Yes. I will say the word lie now. I honestly really hate how much of this video is focused on Franklin and not the survivors. Those brave people who came forward and shared their stories. as well as all of the people standing with them, sharing testimony that shows that Franklin has not always been truthful. Do you have any idea how upsetting it was for me to have to just completely gloss over the wholesome lesbians? As a survivor of abuse, false accusations hurt me on a level that is honestly very difficult to describe. Having a supposed trusted polyam elder being the one to do so really, really hurts. Having to go through baseless claim after baseless claim and show the many ways that they do not hold up is not my idea of a good time. But also, I don't see enough other people doing so. And it should not be on the survivors. Those people have been through enough. This house Franklin has constructed, this ill-conceived shack of lies and falsehoods, it is going to fall apart. And if we don't get outside of it and recognize it for what it is, we will be crushed by it. I escaped such a house once before. I'll be damned if I get taken out by this one now.
Conclusion, aka, how the hell do I end this?
My next video is going to be about puppies. Polyamorous puppies. I wish I could give this story a satisfactory conclusion, but unfortunately, there just isn't one. According to the survivors, the transformative justice process that they sought ultimately ended up failing them. Eve goes into more details about this on the Survivor website, but essentially some of the experts and the people that were brought in to help facilitate and help the process fucked up. Like big time. There were communication issues, isolation within the pod itself, and survivors' needs were not prioritized. This, by the way, is why the Survivor pod was eventually disbanded and the survivors took direct control of the narrative, moving everything over onto their own website and taking control of the Medium account. Now, of course, as a leftist, I approve of seizing the means of accountability, but I'm a bit bummed that it came to that, I'm not gonna lie. As for Franklin, he continues to shout and scream to anybody who will listen. One of his newer tactics seems to be implying that the only reason why he's not believed is because he's a man?
It's a bold strategy, Cotton. Let's see if it pays off for him.
There's definitely a conversation around men not being believed about their abuse, but that's not why people don't believe you, Franklin. It's because of all of the evidence against you. He recently started a Medium account and has even added Abuse Survivor to his Twitter bio. Because if you add it to your Twitter bio, that makes it true. That's why after I'm done filming, I'm going to add Married to Tim from Hello Future Me to mine. Look, Tim, if you're watching, I'm sorry you had to find out this way, but I'll do my best to make you happy. I think you already have a girlfriend, but I'm polyamorous, so we can make that work. At what point is this no longer funny and just kind of creepy? And while by Franklin's own admission, he seems to be moving away from being as active within the polyamorous world, he continues to blame Eve for what he has dubbed a smear campaign against him and just whines unendlessly about his unfair treatment. There are some that I admire who have taken a strong, vocal stance of support for the survivors. Tika Wolf, the creator of Kimchi Cuddles, for example, and Leanne Yao, the polyamorous educator behind the Polyphilia account. Multiamory Podcast has removed the interview with Franklin and Eve from back when More Than Two came out. But other than in passing, that situation really has not been discussed in any detail yet. Poly in the News, a blog that dedicates itself to meaningful discussion around polyamory in the media, has not shared a single article or story about these allegations. And he certainly hasn't shared the Survivor website. I actually at one point reached out to the blog owner just to make sure that I was doing my due diligence, making sure I wasn't overlooking something or not using the search engine right. I have yet to get a response. Many of the reviews I read for More Than Two for this video did not include any kind of update or edit regarding the story and the survivors. Amy Guerin does not make any mention of the abuse allegations on her website, solopoly.net, that I could find. I bring all of this up not because I necessarily want to shame anybody or I think any of these are bad people or anything like that. I've really enjoyed Amy's insights on solo polyamory in the past. I even quoted her in a previous video, and I am a regular listener to the Multiamory podcast, which you will know if you check my resources on literally any of my videos. Do not, I repeat, do not dogpile, harass, or abuse literally anyone, Franklin included, in this video. I bring all of this up because silence is how people like Franklin continue to cause harm in our communities. By ignoring the situation, all we do is embolden him and other abusers to keep screaming their lies. In Why Does He Do That?, Bancroft actually makes a point to address the myth of neutrality, poking holes into the idea that sometimes when faced with conflicting abuse allegations, the best thing to do is just to be quiet and not take sides.
Although an abuser prefers to have you wholeheartedly on his side, he will settle contentedly for your decision to take a middle stance. To him, that means you see the couple's problems as partly her fault and partly his fault, which means it isn't abuse. In reality, to remain neutral is to collude with the abusive man, whether or not that is your goal. If you're aware of chronic or severe mistreatment and do not speak out against it, your silence communicates implicitly that you see nothing unacceptable taking place. Abusers interpret silence as approval, or at least forgiveness.
And sure, some of this we could excuse away, right? Solopoly.net hasn't been updated significantly in years now. Poly in the News pretty much only ever focuses on positive polyam representation and only gets updated once a month now. Sure, okay, fine. But that still equals silence. We can't only be engaged when the polyam rep is good. We can't cheer at Willow Smith but then avert our eyes from Franklin Vo or his eventual replacement. The shame that a bad poly might actually be in our midst proving the haters right cannot be what drives our actions now. It has to be empathy. Speaking for myself just now, I am very frustrated that Franklin Vo did not choose to actually seek real accountability and has mostly just ignored the vast majority of the allegations. I'm really frustrated and upset that the transformative justice process ended up failing the very people it was meant to serve. When people recommend more than two and just conveniently don't mention the allegations, or worse, when the allegations are brought up, then get into this whole, oh, what about Franklin's side, while it's linking to his blatant propaganda, I just want to scream. And most of all, I find myself absolutely infuriated by the number of people who have decided to just ignore the situation, burying their heads in the sand and just treating Franklin like he's some kind of fluke, like some kind of one-off, that this is not emblematic of some kind of larger issue within our community. It's really hard to know how to end this video in light of all of that. If I was going to leave you with any calls to action, it would be to please make sure you go read the Survivor website. I also recommend checking out the community resource spreadsheet that they made. If you see anybody recommending more than two or the game changer, make sure the abuse allegations are being brought up. And if they aren't, be the one to do so. If Franklin is ever invited to a polyamorous conference or to speak on abuse, I know I personally will be making my displeasure known, and I invite all of you to join me on that endeavor. You know, if it happens. I could end this with a message direct to Franklin. I found out actually the day before filming this being January 1st, by the way, that he is aware of this video and the fact that I'm making it. And unsurprisingly, he's already choosing to be a dismissive, defensive twat about it.
Apparently, according to a friend of a friend, some random person I don't know has been researching me and is planning a video expose of some sort for next February. A lot of folks use that word research these days. I do not think it means what they think it means. Yeah, nice use of a Princess Bride meme, you shit.
He hasn't even seen the video and he's already making conclusions about who I am as a person, while also claiming he doesn't know anything about me. Okay, Franklin. But honestly, I've given him enough attention at this point. Let's save that last bit of precious energy for somebody who is actually deserving. I even considered ending this with a message to my former abuser. Certainly there was a time when I fantasized quite a bit about putting him in his place once and for all. You know, an eloquent, well-delivered speech that would just shame him to his core. But it's been 10 years. There's no room for him in my story anymore, not even as an antagonist. Whatever his narrative is, whatever he's constructed out of the wreckage of our relationship, really doesn't matter now. Because the people that love me and care about me and support me, they know the truth. And that's all that matters. Instead, I think I'd like to end this video on 2 things. The first is just to acknowledge that a video of this size and this scope could not have been done nearly as well on my own. There were a lot of moving parts in this, and I want to sincerely thank everybody who helped me, whether you helped me read lines for this. There were a lot of quotes to get through, or my script advisors who were super helpful and really helped me a lot with this, as well as just those who just listened to me rant because I would sometimes get frustrated and just needed to vent my concerns. Second, I'd really like to end this video with a message direct to the people who I hope are watching, that of the alleged survivors whose stories I shared. I really hope that you feel I covered this story in the manner that it so deserves and helped to amplify and share your stories. And I hope you can forgive me for some of the information that I either had to gloss over or else wasn't able to share in trying to still keep the length of this video somewhat accessible. Thank you sincerely to Elaine, Celeste, Amber, Lauren, Paula, Lisa, Joanna, Marissa, Rose, Melanie, and Eve. Thank you for your honesty and your vulnerability. I hope you all feel that when comparing the house you all built to the one Franklin did, that I made it clear yours is on much more solid foundation.
Well, you almost had me fooled. Told me that I was nothing without you. And after everything you've done, oh, I can thank you for how strong I have become. 'Cause you brought the flames and you put me through hell. I had to learn how to fight for myself, and we both know the truth I could tell. I'll just say this is, I wish you farewell. I hope you're somewhere praying, praying. I hope your soul is changing, changing. I hope you find your peace, falling on your knees, praying. I'm proud of who I am. No more monsters, I can breathe again. And you said that I was done. Well, you were wrong, and now the best is yet to come. 'Cause I can make it on my own. And I don't need you, I found a strength I've never known. I'll bring thunder, I'll bring rain. Oh, when I'm finished, they won't even know your name. 'Cause you brought the flames and you put me through hell. I had to learn how to fight for myself, and we both know all the truth I could tell. I'll just say this is, I wish you farewell. I hope you're somewhere praying, praying. I hope your soul is changing, changing. I hope you find your peace, falling on your knees, praying. Or sometimes I pray for you at night, that someday stay, maybe you'd see the light. Oh, some say in life you're gonna get what you give, but some things only God can forgive. Praying, I hope your soul is changing. I hope you find your peace, falling on your knees.